The candle flame trembled in the still air as if afraid to breathe. It threw an unsteady halo into the cold chamber and made a wavering gold banner of the smoke that climbed toward the stone-vaulted ceiling. Beneath that thin, living light, Jon listened to his own pulse with the astonishment of a man who had woken beneath a mountain of snow to discover that his lungs could still swell. The first nights afterward were a procession of small wonders that his mind would not make sense of. The scratch of wool on skin, the burn, and then the relief as the brazier was stoked. The way the room itself seemed reintroduced to him as though it had a new language. He remembered cold that went past bone, the feel of knives, the surprise of it all, and then the darkness that had not been empty but crowded with an absence that watched him back. He remembered Melisandre's voice as if heard through ice. He remembered Ghost's muzzle pressed to his hand until hair and breath roused the world again. Castle Black had always been a thing of hard angles to him, a bristling of black timber and iron that stooped under the wind but never bent. Now, as he stood and dressed and felt the weight of his scabbard at his hip once more, he realized how the place was also composed of quiet. The quiet of snow collecting in corners where the wind had scoured it from the yard, the quiet of ravens that shifted on their perches and spoke in low throats as if mindful of sleep. There were moments in that first week when his own footsteps on the frost-hardened planks startled him. Not the sound, but that it was possible there would be a second step after the first. He kept away from the yard when he could, and from men's eyes, and most of all from the shadow of his old door with its knife-chopped wood. Melisandre said little. She did not gloat. She did not preach. She came sometimes to the doorway and regarded him with a fatigue deeper than her voice, and sometimes she looked into the brazier until the pupils vanished from her eyes. There was a fragility to her afterward, not of bone but of certainty. When she knelt by the fire to feed it with twig ends, her fingers were methodical and ordinary. He would have found it easier to hate her then. Davos sat with him each morning, bringing salted broth with a steadiness Jon came to rely on in place of appetite. The broth was thin and often lukewarm by the time it reached him, but Davos seemed to think it did a man more good to watch someone watching him try to swallow than to be left alone to it. He spoke as men speak when grief has taken up lodging with them, not in laments but with a careful courtesy that did not bump against the furniture of loss. It was the fourth morning when the knight came with eyes red-rimmed and a piece of white cloth tucked into his belt like a token he'd half a mind to throw away. He did not sit. He kept his hands busy on the rim of the bowl he had carried, turning it. A boy came in from the south, he said, skin and bones under his cloak. He came along the king's road in the dark and hid by day, he says. He had the look of madness about him and the look of truth besides. Davos swallowed. Stannis is dead. Jon had known somehow that a message like this would find the cold. The whole wall had felt poised for a story to break and run. He nodded. How? Battle and after. He tried Winterfell and Winterfell chewed us, Davos said, voice low. The snow did for us as much as spears. Then he was found by a woman who had something old against him. She took his head from him under a gray sky, and if there was any justice in it, I hope the gods were watching, though I doubt they were. The boy carried a scrap from a banner the men had wrapped his body in before they fled. He gave me that. Said he couldn't carry the head as proof. Davos drew out the cloth and unfolded it with hands that wanted to be gentle and did not know how. The cloth had once been white and carried a leaping black stag worked over in thread that had bled and run in weather. A little of it was crisp with frozen blood. Jon touched the edge of it. He thought of the stubbornness in Stannis's jaw and the way the man had been a kind of iron hammer in a world of brass trinkets. He saw in his mind the painted table he had never seen but had imagined whenever Stannis or Melisandre spoke of Dragonstone. The table like a continent itself, carved into coasts and rivers under a roof of stone in a castle made to resemble the bones of beasts no man living could remember. War and kings were the game upon that table. To have died and then be told of a dead king made something tilt inside him, a sensation like a ship heaving and chopping at anchor. Shireen? He asked after a moment. He did not look at Melisandre when he said it. Davos put the cloth down and passed a hand over his face. Dead, he said. The word was small. He seemed to taste it as if it were a thing beneath his tongue that could not be swallowed. There were no prayers that would have made a difference to that. There were only considerations. Jon sat with the knowledge a while. The brazier breathed. Davos's gaze had gone to the fire, as if there were something in the coals that would explain life to him. That evening the wind came hard out of the west and made a reed pipe out of the cracks between plank and plank. It brought the smell of the forest up on the air, resin and damp rot and the iron of frozen streambeds. Jon went to the wall walk where snow had gathered against the shutter and looked east toward where the world opened onto water. It always astonished him how much sea there was behind the wall, how the earth's back rolled and dropped into that waste as if the land itself had grown tired and had decided to lie down and leave the rest to water. Eastwatch was a place of gray flags and old ropes and the weariness of sails. From the ice he could sometimes make out the smudge of the sea beyond, nothing, then less than nothing, a mood rather than a sight. Tonight he could taste salt, though the air here almost always tasted of rock and frost. He did not mean to sleep that night, and he had no memory of lying down, but he woke in the small hours with a sense of having fallen for a long while in a place where falling does not require height. He had been in a hall of stone lit by candlelight that had its own weather. The walls had not been walls but ribs. Dragons the size of halls had wrapped themselves around the whole of the island, so that what men called rooms were hollows between bones. The sea spoke under the floor and the floor spoke back. On the great table that mapped the world, someone had set a knife upright at the place where a single mountain rose in a crouch and exhaled smoke into the winter. Then he had not been in a hall at all, but inside a cave where black glass crowded the earth like stars that had been sifted into the dirt, millions upon millions of points. When he woke he had Ghost's quiet weight against him, the direwolf's eyes reflecting that candle's wavering so that every time the flame moved the white wolf's gaze deepened, and deepened more, until it seemed like the animal was a doorway into night. He rose at dawn and sought Ed in the yard, where the snow squeaked under boot soles and the traces of last night's wind still skittered along the ground like cats. Ed had the deep-worn look of a man who has found a way through honest misery and is suspicious of any other kind. When he saw Jon approaching, he put his hands into his cloak as if tucking them in armor. "I need you to hold," Jon said. Once they had walked side by side under the lee of the stairs to the hall. He kept his voice low. "For a little while. There is work I must do that's not here. If this is about cleaning the jakes, I can tell you to your face that I'll do it as well as any dead man," Ed said, then ran a finger along his jaw as if surprised to find humor there. "You have somewhere you mean to go in the heart of a winter that wants to eat us off our bones." "Dragonstone," Jon said, and the saying of the name surprised him with the certainty in it. "Stannis is dead. His seat is empty. Men will be moving. There's a thing I saw in dreams that I think isn't all dream. Dragonglass under the island. Enough to make knives for a nation. Enough to make spears for a realm. If we are to hold the north, we need something more than steel and stubbornness. We need fire melted into stone." It studied him. The wind had made his eyes run and turned his nose raw. "Dragonstone is a long sailing, and there are men around it who still think Cersei has teeth. You plan to ask?" He raised a brow. "Or to take?" "I mean to claim what is mine," Jon said. He felt the words extend in front of him the way a man might lay a plank over dark water and then step out and trust it to hold his weight. Ed did not move for a space of breaths. He turned his head and spat thoughtfully into the snow where it hissed and then took the spittle for its own. "You died," he said at last, not as a challenge but in the manner of a witness reporting the day's weather. "You were Lord Commander, then you were a dead man, and now you tell me you're a prince with a fat hill of black glass to his name. I suppose if there were a time to change trades, this must be it." His mouth made a shape that might have been a smile if it had ever learned the trick. "Hold or die," he added, and clapped Jon once, hard on the shoulder. The thing about truths was that once you dragged one out into the light, others crept out after it, not all under your command. The following day, as if to answer the birth of the first truth, the gate at Castle Black swung inward and admitted a retinue that any sensible place might have shut without parley. They came out of the wind with it in their cloaks and hair. Slender gray man, girl of willow and wire, men with spears whose heads had been dipped in a swamp's memory. The man had a face like weathered oak carved long ago and not looked at since. He bowed the way trees bow when they must and shifted his bare hands around a bundle wrapped in oilskin that he did not hold like something of much value and yet carried with the tenderness one shows a thing that has survived. "Howland Reed," he said. He took in the yard with the old courtesy that looked like nothing so much as contempt for pomp. His gaze found Jon and measured him and softened and became uncertain. "I was asked to tell you when the year came that would not end. There are years that end and years that stretch. This one seems to me to be the latter. Yet I think you'll do well to hear me now." He was given a place by the brazier and a cup of hot wine whose sweetness his mouth seemed to regard with sadness. He unwrapped the oilskin and set a little bundle of papers and a ring down on the table. Curved gold shaped as if the smith had set his whole hand into the metal and squeezed until it remembered him. The gold was worked with three-headed dragons that had almost been rubbed smooth by time and touch. On a thin ribbon there was a lock of hair that had once been the color of sunlight through ale. "I stood with your father the day your mother died," Howland Reed said, and Jon felt the world move under his feet in a small way, as if a current had found a new path below the ice. "I went with a man I loved as much as any man can love another who is not his child or his father, to a tower that stood where it was no business of ours to allow any tower to stand. He gave me directions in a voice that did not tremble when there were 7 of us and 3 of them. He told me to cut the throats of my own fear and my own doubt and follow him up, and I did so. When it was done, Ned Stark held his sister in his arms while she died of blood and fever, and she made him swear a thing that I helped him carry the weight of later, when he had to return to the world and tell it a lie so beautiful and so hard that it made him a kind of saint in the minds of fools and a disappointment in the minds of those who need men to bleed on the floor to admire them." He pushed a paper forward with 2 fingers. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times that it had learned to break. Reed held it down with the ring, as if to keep the words from flying. "This is a record, set down by a man in a little sept that hid in the mountain's shadow. He was a pious man who wrote down every time someone coughed and whether a bird in the eaves had nested or flown. He thought it God's work to say what had happened without opinion. He notes in his hand that a prince called Rhaegar, son of Aerys, wed Lyanna, daughter of Rickard Stark, in the old style and the new, before 2 witnesses and the cold itself. I have carried this long enough. There is also the ring she wore. Your uncle would not take it. He preferred regret to adornment. Men think that makes them noble. It makes them quiet to live beside and difficult to love." Jon reached toward the paper. He looked at the hand, not the words. The hand was clear as winter. The signature at the bottom was as plain as the man who had written it, unadorned. He felt something he had been carrying since boyhood changed shape. He had spent his youth trying to tame curiosity, to shepherd away the dangerous sheep of hope. Now one of those beasts had stepped out of the herd and stood in the doorway and refused to go back to the field. He lifted the ring. It was not a king's ring. It was a thing meant to be worn away to the memory of itself by a woman who used her hands. When he slid it onto his middle finger, it hung loose. He could almost hear the refusing laughter of a younger, stubborn aunt he had never known. He closed his hand and felt the metal warm against his palm. "I do not want a crown," he said, the old protest softening in his mouth as if he had forgotten how to say it. "I don't even know that I want a name other than the one the man who raised me called me. I have not dreamed of thrones." "Thrones are chairs with expectations," Howland Reed said. "Dragonstone is a place. It is your place by law older than this bad year. The realm is in love with symbols, and I am old enough to admit that symbols help men move their feet. A prince of Dragonstone who does not go to King's Landing and kick in the doors is a new thought and might be a useful one. There are dead men marching in the north and fools arguing in the south about whose boots belong on which bits of rug. Perhaps a prince who cares more about the cold than the sitting would be a draught of clean water after a long walk in dust." Melisandre had come to his shoulder the way the smell of cinnamon comes to wine. She watched through the flame rather than through eyes that looked at faces. "The prince that was promised is not promised a chair," she murmured. "Only a war." Davos drew a finger along the rim of the paper. Stannis sat at Dragonstone, and the table made him believe the world could be arranged if only he pushed the ships and men where they went on the wood. I told him once that fish are no respecters of lines only men can see. He laughed. He made me swear loyalty to his daughter. The sand and the sea took her, and my oath has nowhere to sit any longer. Perhaps it could stand with you a while. It was not in Jon's nature to make quick speeches. He felt his breath move in him like a tide. Out, in, out. I mean to go, he said, and felt the words set something in himself to rights. I will not call myself king. I will call myself by my father's blood where it matters and by my father's love where it matters more. I will claim Dragonstone because black glass lives under it and because the world seems set on ignoring what is coming for it. I will set men to work carving arrowheads even if they think it an insult to their long swords. I will lie and bargain and beg for ships in White Harbor. I will bring free folk if they will come, and I will write to houses who remember old things and tell them that remembering alone has never saved anyone. I will go by water because the roads are murder now. Who will come? Davos's mouth twisted. I was a smuggler once, he said. I know the steps that go down to a little beach where an unwise man can land at midnight. I know the currents that run between the island and the rock where cormorants sit like merchants making lists. I could find my way up with my eyes shut and my nose full of smoke. Tormund showed his teeth. If there is a big pile of black ice under an island and you mean to chip it out to cut the dead apart, I will come and grunt and swing a pick, and then we will drink. That sounds to me like a night my father would find worthy. Howland Reed inclined his head. I am going back to my waters, he said. I am a man who lives in a place that pretends to be a lake but is in fact an army of knives if you put your foot wrong. Dragonstone is not my business. But I have said what I came to say, and I choose to see your mother's eyes in your face when you decide something, and that has made me less lonely than I have been. For that I thank you. It took 3 days to make ready because nothing in winter takes 1 day and nothing in war takes 2. Jon wrote by candlelight in tight hand, to Wyman Manderley at White Harbor, to Glover at Deepwood Motte, to a Celtigar whose crab claws in his arms had amused him as a child when he had learned the heraldry of houses he would never see. He wrote to Riverrun and to Starfall and to Sunspear, where he trusted no letter would persuade, but where some cousin of a memory might be wakened by the syllables of Rhaegar's name. He wrote to the Iron Bank and asked them what price there was on prudence. He wrote to Bear Island and did not bother to make the words fine. Melisandre watched him and sometimes put a finger to the page when he paused, as if pinning down a word that had started to creep. Ghost disliked the sea and sulked as only a creature built for snow can sulk when made to stand on planks over a living thing that moves under one. The dire wolf would not go below. He planted himself in a corner near the prow with his ears pinned and his eyes constantly recording the horizon for treachery. Jon stood beside him for a time at departure and looked back as the high slice of ice diminished. The wall made its own weather. He had once imagined that if he could only get far enough from it, he might see it as a long bar under the sky, a thing a man could say with a gesture and be right. From the sea, it made itself into a cliff rising like a god that slept upright. He watched it until it had turned into a pale thought. He did not look at the yard where the knives had met his skin. There is a way water has of convincing you that the earth never held still. A day and a night and a day, and he was a man walking across a world that pitched and bowed. Davos stood straight as if the deck had formed to his feet, and he talked to the crew in the low, practical tones that men use to coax recalcitrant ropes and iron that has grown stiff. Tormund laughed whenever the ship attacked a wave as if the sea had insulted him and he had decided to take it personally. Melisandre did not come on deck unless the sun had gone to ground. She stood then with a face like an old statue and did not shiver. They ran south and a little east when the wind allowed it, and when it did not they tacked like thieves. At night the stars came out and made a roof, and sometimes Melisandre looked up as if she were reading a letter someone had hidden up there long ago, and sometimes Jon looked up and saw a whiteness that took him back to the breath between life and whatever it had been. The Shivering Sea is named for men who do not know what shivering is, Davos told him dryly. The narrow sea in winter was a beast with fewer teeth but a longer tongue. They made for White Harbor not for comfort but for ships and men and coin. Wyman Manderley welcomed the idea of a stark face with a dragon in its shadow more than he welcomed Jon himself. He was a lord who preferred symbols to the men who carried them and pies to both. He weighed Jon while he drank and weighed him again while he ate and weighed him again while he refused a second cup. Then he called for his steward and had 2 ships fitted with canvas that did not leak and had his scribes run off letters bearing his own seal to houses who owed him an evening's courtesy. Jon left White Harbor with a hold of hard bread and a sense that he had been measured and found to be the exact weight required by a plan that had been waiting for a weight precisely his size. They rounded Skagos where the cliffs bit at the sky, and there were moments when the sea did a slow roll that made even Davos go quiet and look into the middle distance with his teeth set. Winter birds went on for their own errands with their heads cocked as if in private study. He dreamed again of the hall of ribs and candlelight. He dreamed that when he laid his palm on the painted table, he could feel a heartbeat through the wood. He dreamed of a girl with gray eyes he had never seen, holding a feather and whispering to it as if it were a secret she wished to teach to the air. The first sight of Dragonstone came on a pre-dawn that had in it more iron than gold. The island rose out of the water with more intention than islands usually show. Its mountain crouched like a hound that had waited too long for a hand that would not come. The sea around it was a broth of cold and current that made little whirlpools appear and vanish without anyone consenting. Davos's crew changed their faces when they recognized the line of the coast. There is a muscle in the jaw that only memory moves. The steps were where Davos said they would be. The black mouth of the little cave breathed out a stale damp as if it had opinions about them. The pebbles on the strand had been rounded by centuries of tides into the sensation of holding glass beads in one's fist. "Smuggler's steps," Davos said, and patted the rock as though it were a stubborn mare that he meant to sweeten. "Best not to count them. You lose count and you throw in your dinner before you throw in your fear." They climbed under a sky that had stored away its stars. The steps were irregular and slick with salt, worn by the unrecorded traffic of 1,000 small shames and necessary reliefs. A man who had never thought himself a goat could feel himself a goat on those steps, with his fingers searching for little flaws in the stone that might pretend to be handholds. Jon's breath plumed and failed and began again. The wind came laterally, finding every stitch in his cloak. Ghost made a soft noise that Jon had never heard from him, like the smallest whine a wolf might allow when the ground itself feels false. He went first after Davos because there were times when a man could not ask others to go where he would not set his own boot down. They came out in a cleft and then into a passage where the wind was strangled and then onto a shelf of rock that brought them to a low door cunningly made to look like part of the cliff itself. Davos pressed his ear to the wood and then pushed. They entered a corridor, and the smell hit him. Old smoke held in stone, salt that had learned to pretend to be dust, and something else, an astringent stale at the edge of the air like the breath of a place that has been left alone too long and is embarrassed to be seen. The stone drum's great hall made a memory out of everyone who stepped into it. The first of their party came in with their torches held so the flames made gestures at the carved beasts. The dragons had been chiseled out of the island's bones and set to wind around arches and columns. Their stone scales caught light and imprisoned it in a way that made the eyes see movement where there could not be any. Shadows made the creatures breathe. Tormund stopped. His torch held out as though it were a truth he was seeing whether or not he accepted it, and laughed an astonished laugh that did not insult the room. "A cave of dragon bones," he said softly in the way a large man sometimes lowers his voice out of respect for an impossible thing. They went to the painted table. The table owned the hall without dominating it. It was a depth of wood stained to a dark, almost black, with the whole of Westeros carved into it as if a man had decided on a winter day to make a world and then had done so. Rivers crawled like silver scars. Mountains stood up in ridges that invited fingers. Little iron markers lay in a handful by the corner like bits of a game whose rules had been forgotten. Jon ran his palm along the north and felt something in his chest that might have been grief and might have been fidelity and might have been both at once. "Light it," he said. He meant the hall, but also something larger. Men moved with that particular quickness that comes from the desire to make a new place a place where a man can sleep. Torches found sconces. The first heat began to pool around the feet of the nearer columns. Somebody dragged a brazier into service and filled it with coal that stank and then grew warm. Davos went on a short, practical expedition and came back with a small barrel and a grin that carried, for once, uncomplicated pleasure. "Wine," he announced, "and vinegar. The cooking room will be a horror. The good news is we have 4 chairs that haven't fallen to pieces. The bad news is they are the ugliest chairs in the narrow sea." There was a Lannister garrison of 20 men and a board sergeant in charge, and they were more a suggestion than a defense. They had grown thin on rationed oats and indignation. The first that Jon knew of them was the sound of boots and a shout that wanted to be authoritative and came out hopeful. Davos raised his hands and spoke the sergeant down like a man soothing a frightened horse. Tormund stood where he could be seen and grinned in a way that promised a kind of pain no one had the appetite for that early in the morning. They were disarmed with the weary relief of men who have been holding onto the wrong end of a rope for too long. Jon promised them passage to the mainland with provisions if they would sign papers saying they had served bravely and seen nothing that required courage. The sergeant asked for onions. Davos gave him onions and had to turn away to hide his expression. The first letter Jon sent from Dragonstone was not to a lord but to Ed at Castle Black. A short thing that said "We live." It also said "There is more black glass than I dreamed." It also said "Tell Sam to go to Old Town now, and tell him to read fast and think faster and not to hold his breath for permission." And at the bottom he wrote, "If men come to you from the south with banners in their eyes and ambition in their mouths, do not let them teach you politesse while the dead learn to march." The letters to lords followed. He did not call himself king. He signed Jon, of Winterfell by love and of Dragonstone by law, and he let the little 3-headed dragon and wolf of the seal Melisandre made for him burn itself into wax until the symbol was a thing people would argue about. The first to answer was Celtigar from Claw Isle, who came in person in a ship that looked like a crane and had sails the color of a sour apple. The Celtigar was a thin man with hands as soft as a boy's that he kept hidden in sleeves as if ashamed. He walked the hall of the stone drum the way monks walk churches. He was younger than Jon had expected and had the eyes of a man who spent more time with his own thoughts than with other men's voices. "My house has a memory long enough to be a nuisance to itself," he said without greeting. "We remember dragons, and we remember knees bending, and we remember the price we paid for both. The Lannisters forgot us as neatly as a man forgets a small debt he owed to a fool. I am a Celtigar, and I am tired of being ignored by men who have forgotten how to count." He inclined his head a little, enough to be respectful and not enough to humiliate himself. "If you seek Dragonstone to make knives out of glass for men to carry into a night that is growing teeth, then the Isle of Claws will go on record as saying that is the first sensible proposal made in the South this year." He sent men with spades and engineers with a sense of the earth under their boots down into the gut of the island where basalt remembered fire. The first time Jon went into the caves, he understood the dream. The rock swallowed light and threw it back in thin, homely gestures. Under their torches, the dragonglass gleamed like black ice pretending to be a jewel modestly. It was in seams and in plates and in a fine grit underfoot. When he bent and pried up a shard, it split cleanly in his hand, as if eager to become what he needed of it. He held it and saw the blue eyes of a thing he had killed and then thought maybe he had only slowed it, and his palm closed by itself. They made a place for shaping. A long bench of a table with leather between the stone and wood to quell the seduction of splinters. Men learned how to nap again. There is a language in rock that a patient man can hear. You tap lightly here because this is where the fault will run. You never strike in anger. You are courteous even with stone. He stood with his sleeves rolled back and watched the first arrowheads come to life under callous thumbs, the long knives shedding flakes that collected like a shine of broken stars in the sawdust. He watched Tormund try and fail and try again until a blade came off in his palm that would have cut his father's laughter from his mouth. He watched men who had never thought themselves artists consider edges as if they were a form of prayer. At night he ate badly and thought well. He slept a little and dreamed less. He walked the parapets and learned the island's many voices. How the sea sounds different when the tide turns. How the wind tells you a storm is coming by the pitch it takes in its throat. He knew the gulls who had made the little ledge under the east tower into a place where one bird was always scolding another for existing. He learned to read the faces of the new men who came in by ones and twos and threes. Stormlanders with bad memories and better swords, Riverlanders with hands chapped from years of hauling nets to feed soldiers who did not say thank you. A few city men with thin wrists who had run from a woman in King's Landing who wore a crown like a knife belt. He put them all to work. He put noble hands to fetching water and low-born hands to drafting letters until the boundaries amused him, and he discovered that the writing did not suffer. He had expected to feel something like joy and felt instead something like permission. He thought of Ned Stark in the long summer evenings when Winterfell's wall guarded shade like a secret, telling him truths that he was too young to understand that were in fact instructions in a code. You must be the one who says no if the word no is wanted. The word no is as valuable as the word yes but sells for less. A man is not his father's blood alone, but any man who thinks he can live without it is a child. The second week a galley came from Driftmark, low in the water, bearing a banner whose silver seahorse had lost most of its gleam. The lord who came from it, Montrese Valerion's widow's nephew, or something to that effect, Jon's scribe guessed and meant obviously nobody in the line anyone had bothered to memorize, was a man who had learned to speak without showing the bottom row of his teeth. He bowed and offered oaths that tasted of salt. He wanted assurance. He wanted to know what the Prince of Dragonstone meant to be Prince of. Jon told him this: I will be lord of this island, and I will be its steward. I will not be a creditor. I will not ask of you what I am not willing to give you, that if the dead come down in a wave out of a cold that has not known kindness in 1,000 years, we will not hide in our islands and hope that the mainland will supply us with excuses. The man nodded, slow, relieved to be told words that were not the usual ones. He left behind a crew of smiths who had built anchors and now found delight in the new shapes of these black knives that were light in the hand and strong to the edge. He left behind 2 barrels of salt fish that tasted like memory. Jon walked on the beach that evening with Ghost and felt the sand give under him just enough to remind him that no step is quite like any other. The wolf trotted ahead and then came back and leaned into him and then went ahead again as if leading a man who needed to be led only so much. Messages went out and came in. Sunspear did not answer, which is sometimes the most eloquent of answers. Oldtown answered with a letter whose words were long even by the measure of men who write in lightless rooms. They were polite and advised patience. The Iron Bank answered with a question. What do you intend to do with the living when you are done with the dead? Jon wrote back. Prevent them from becoming dead sooner than they need to. The Iron Bank responded. That is not a strategy. He sent Davos to White Harbor with a list of needs and a list of promises and the understanding that lists not written in blood convince more men than those that are. Sansa came by way of Gulltown with a small guard of men with the wary eyes of veterans whose clothes suggested they had been instructed to look like farmers. She took the steps slower than pride wanted. When she saw him, she did not run or smile or behave as any story says a sister should behave. She looked at him a long while from 10 paces away, and he looked back, and then she came and put her forehead to his chest, not as a child to a parent but as a person to a wall, and exhaled a breath that was partly anger and partly relief and partly confession. He put his arms around her and thought, absurdly, of the onions he had parted with for the Lannister sergeant. When he told her what Howland Reed had told him, she sat and listened without speaking, her expression doing little, and yet he could read in it the arithmetic of a mind putting numbers into columns. When he finished, she said, So you are a prince and I am a lady, and neither of us is anything like the child we thought we would be. Did he love her? Yes, Jon said, because the room itself would have corrected him if he had lied. He loved her, and she him, Sansa said, and he set aside another woman to do it. She did not look at Melisandre when she said it. She did not need to, and our father spent the rest of his life walking around with a secret that soaked his boots. That doesn't make him less my father. It makes him more a thing that can be loved. I am tired of men and their romantic crimes. I find I admire instead the thing that keeps dinner coming. He could have laughed if laughing had not felt like an unkindness to something sacred. He said, We are making knives of glass to cut the cold. She stood and went to the mouth of the cave and looked out at the strip of ocean the island allowed the eye at that angle. Then let's cut, she said. The first dead men that came to Dragonstone were carried on a small, ragged boat that had been stitched with gray dreams into staying afloat. They were not walking. They were what men become when the sea keeps them too long and remembers to return them too late. The fishermen who found them had the faces of men who knew the valuable difference between a thing found and a thing kept. They sent a boy running up the steps to speak. Jon went with Melisandre and a man whose faith was steel and a man whose faith was salt, and they studied the two that lay there like warnings dressed in rags. In those faces you could see the indecency of winter. They burned them and stood until even the smoke was convinced, and afterward the boy who had run up the steps asked Jon for 2 coppers and an onion. Davos gave him both and gave him a loaf besides and watched him go with that tight look around the mouth that marked a man who suspected that generosity was not a currency accepted by the world and insisted on spending it anyway. Some nights Jon went alone to the painted table and lit only the one candle that had been there the night he arrived. The island slept loudly, as islands do. The sea spoke to itself. He put his palm on the place where Winterfell had been carved and could feel nothing but wood and his own blood. Once he put his hand where King's Landing lay as if to reassure himself that he had no wish to go there. His hand then slid, almost without his permission, to the small swirl of wood where Dragonstone's shortened peninsula reached into the sea. His thumb traced the outline of the island. He was learning the language of maps in the way a man learns to read a lover's palm. Not for the fortune-telling but for the feeling that the familiar skin gives back when you draw across it with care. A raven came one dusk with a scrap of vellum tied too tightly around its leg. Sam's hand. The script untidy and beloved. Oldtown's men are masters at circling, it read. I have learned to count their circles and to walk in a straight line while they are doing so. There are records here of men who lit black candles to read by. There are records here of men who saw ice turn to something that remembered itself as a man. There is a ledger here written by a man with a conscience who hid it from his fellows and locked it behind a joke. There is a mention of a mountain under the island that was already old when men were new. There is more, always more. I am writing faster than I breathe. Jon read it twice and set it down because he had the sudden childish desire to bite the paper to taste Sam's effort. He looked up and the candle had burned down to a thumb. He let it gutter and then pinched it out between finger and thumb, and sternly did not regret the small, ordinary pain. In the 3rd week a ship with a square sail came slanting toward the harbor with that dangerous speed that means urgency more than skill. Its hull was scarred and its figurehead had lost half its dignity to weather. The banner that ran out as they made the turn toward the lee of the stone was green, and on the green a golden rose that had had better days. The man who came out of it had a mouth that made promises without effort and a body that suggested he had lain in the sun whenever possible. He was a Tyrell cousin, and he had with him an account of the journey south that was half gossip and half catastrophe, which is to say precisely the news couriers bring. King's Landing is a snake box, he said brightly over the meat Davos had bullied from the kitchen. The Queen pretends otherwise and doesn't call it that. She has made enemies of everyone who writes down their thoughts farther south than a barn door. The faith is a tree that will not stop growing, and she is a man trying to prune it with a fishbone. There is word of a silver-haired queen in the east with 3 fires in her pocket and 50,000 men in her shadow. If she crosses, the city will explode into adoration or fear and possibly both. Jon looked past him at the sea that did not blink. If she crosses, let her come to these halls, he said. The words coming from a place in him he had not expected to be more than a chamber of thoughts. Let her look at this table and let her tell me whether she means to be a storm or a shelter. Let her tell me what she intends to do about winter. If she wishes to be my queen, I will bend the knee. If she wishes to be a story, I will listen to it and then go back to work. Sansa's mouth tightened, not disapproving but not warm. What you maya? N, she said later when the Tyrell cousin had been guided toward a bed he would find cold, is that you will not let yourself be arranged like a piece. I have learned to admire that. I mean, Jon said, that we need fire and we need truth and we need any men who can count past their own dinner to look north. I have no ambition that involves a throne with swords coming out of it. I have an ambition that involves fewer dead children. If a queen from across the sea wishes to bring dragons to that ambition, the door is open and the steps are steep and the hall is cold, and I will pour her the worst wine in the narrow sea." They laughed then, with the rare ease of laughter that comes when two people have faced in different directions and discovered they were not walking away from one another after all. The laughter went out into the hall and found the dragons on their columns and sat with them a while, and perhaps even those stone beasts entertained the notion of being less terrifying for a breath. By the start of the 4th week, the rhythm of the place had become a beat that men's feet knew. A ship went out every morning with stone and came back every evening with fish and rumor. The miners learned when to stop before the earth's mood changed. The smiths learned to tie glass into leather with a finesse that kept gloved hands safe. The ravens that lived up under the roof grew used to man noise and resumed their economy of comment. Jon stood each day in the little court to hear petitions. He found he had more patience than he'd imagined for stories about fences and sons who had done the wrong thing when they were drunk. He learned to gauge quickly whether a woman seeking salt money wanted it for bread or for pride, and he stopped caring which was the nobler cause. He did not pretend to a grandeur he did not own. When a delegation came from Claw, asking him to decide whether their Westfield belonged properly to a cousin now dead or to a brother perhaps worse than dead, he did what Ned Stark would have done. He walked until his boots were wet with the question. He stood in the field and let his feet tell him which way the water went, and he put his hand to the earth and let it give him the facts men do not know to lie about. In the end, he decided for the brother because the brother had a wife with eyes that had already done enough paying for a lifetime. Afterward, he wrote to the cousin's widow with a hand that went a little slower than usual and told her it was not justice but something short of it, and asked her to bear it as an ugly friend. That night there was a storm. Not a grand storm, the narrow sea has grand storms and petty ones both, but a mean one that had no art about it. The wind came in from the southeast with a determination that felt personal. The sea climbed the steps and had to be kicked down again by the rock. The windows rattled like teeth. In the hall, the braziers had to be fed constantly because the storm drank heat as if it were sweet. Jon walked the parapets and let the rain make him a creature without a border. Ghost stayed in the doorway and voiced his opinion every little while without commitment. He was there when the lookout by the harbor bell rang it, once and then 3 times and then 2 and then paused, an odd pattern. Men moved in the rain like men who have been told the sea has produced a god and they are to go witness it. Jon went to the outer wall and looked out. There, coming out of the rain toward the lee where they had laid new moorings with thick rope and thicker prayers, were 3 long shapes with prows that did not belong to the Ironborn and sails that the storm had turned into flayed flags. The ships came on without panic and without arrogance. They slowed as a man slows when he enters another man's room without permission but in the certainty of need. They made the moorings with the carefulness of men whose hands know how to respect both rope and pride. The first of the new arrivals leaned out and caught the tossed line and made it fast with no show. The banners that unrolled then did so not with flourish but with the dignity of cloth made heavy by rain. A red 3-headed dragon, a black field, the memory of a river of fire that had once run in men's heads. The second banner that came out on the second ship took longer to reveal itself because the wind made it flirt and then slap, and when at last it swung round so that the men on the wall could see it, a murmur went along the stones that had in it both recognition and the thrill of the threatening unknown. A gray wolf running. Jon stood and let the rain run into his eyes and did not blink until it stung. He looked at the banners and then at the men at his back who waited for the sort of instruction that never comes in words. He set his palm on the stone and felt the old bones of the island. He thought of his father lying to save him. He thought of a woman in a tower who wanted a promise more than she wanted pity. He thought of Stannis and his stiff neck and the little girl who had made his oath worth known to a man who had not known who to be loyal to when there was no man in the room who deserved it. He thought of Ghost, who snorted again as if to say that wolves had been chasing dragons in dreams since before the first man learned to count. "Bring them in," Jon said, his voice level and ringing a little in the stone. He turned to Davos, who had come to stand at his shoulder without announcing himself, water pouring off the point of his nose. "If this is who it seems to be, bring them in dry. If it is not, bring them in wet. Send to the kitchens for broth and for that wine that tastes like someone with skill failed at something noble. Let the men carry their own swords, but take the archers up along the inner parapets just the same." Davos grinned a short, proud grin. "Aye, my prince," he said, and the word did not fall foolishly in the hall. Jon went down the stairs with Ghost at his heels, and the storm pressed its hand against the side of the stone drum as if asking to be let in to hear a new story. He walked with the steadiness of a man who had decided what his name meant to him and had made that meaning into something like a bannerman. Behind him, the painted table waited with all of Westeros laid out upon it like a promise. In front of him, the sea surrendered the ships it had played with, and the dock planks made their talk of old salt and old knots. The first figure stepped onto the wet wood, a woman with hair like a coin minted from moonlight and a face set to the work of decision. The second came after, tall and dark and watchful, with a look to him like a man who had once been nearly broken and found, in the breaking, the shape he ought to be. The rain made all banners equal. The wind blew the smoke down the chimneys and then back up again. The island of Dragonstone, which had wanted breath and men and intention and law, took all of it into its stone and prepared, as islands must, to endure. The woman stood in the rain as if she had worn worse weather on her skin for years. Her hair was the pale of a coin the mint had never circulated, braided close and tight for sea work and crowned not in metal but by the plain authority of necessity. Her cloak was sodden, pulled close, and when she stepped forward the dock creaked as the island took the measure of her weight. Behind her came a man with a spear who made the rain seem hesitant to touch him at all. His eyes moved as if counting threats and sums both, and he had the stillness of a blade on a sharpening stone. After these two, there was a shorter figure with a face that had learned every kind of smile and put them all away like winter coats. He reached up and tapped a finger against the haft of the ladder as he came down it, as if it were a polite friend. Jon went to meet them, feeling the sea in his joints, the steadying press of Ghost against his knee. The hall at his back breathed warmth into the storm so that the rain stood up and hissed where the two weathers met. Davos moved a little to Jon's left, hands visible, his face doing that open trick it had learned in King's Landing that made fools less inclined to be brave. Sansa waited above under the arch, the hood of her cloak drawn, eyes level and careful. "Dragonstone," the woman said. "At last." "Targaryen," Davos murmured beside Jon, the single word respectful and not. A smuggler's memory of banners and the men who claim them. Jon inclined his head without theatrics. "My lady," he said into the rain, and both the title and the temper of it were chosen and held. "Come inside. Storms here like to overhear." She studied him for a breath with that unfriendly frankness rulers learn when flattery has wasted their time too often. Then she gestured once with two fingers, and her people moved. The spearman, he needed no banner to proclaim command. It was written in the set of his shoulders, looked to his armed detail, made a sign that put them in a posture that would not scare islanders and would not make fools of themselves if the room demanded blood. The small man paused to pat the wet flank of the nearest mooring post as if to thank it, then followed in with a gait half-lilt, half-caution. They crossed into the mouth of the stone drum, and the room swallowed the weather with the relief of a starving host. Torches took up their duties. Smoke turned lazy and began its long courtship of the ceiling. The carved dragons along the columns watched in their stone way, pretending to be architecture while they chose sides. Jon led them toward the low blaze under the great arch. A table had been set there with bowls of steaming broth and a wine that tried to apologize for itself. Men drifted in along the walls with that good mixture of curiosity and discipline that says a place has not yet forgotten its own shape. "I came for a chair," the woman said without sitting. Her voice had a texture to it, like silk stretched over wood, soft and strong both. "And find a man. The chair can wait. The man cannot. I am Daenerys of the House Targaryen. People have called me many things I did not choose. What do you call yourself here?" "Jon," he said, "of Winterfell by love, of Dragonstone by law." The small man made a sound that wanted to be a laugh and forbore. "The law and the love," he said. "Neither keep their dates, yet both show up when it matters. Jon Snow unless rumor is drunk. And if rumor is drunk, I have known it to be correct all the same. It's good to see you again if this is seeing." I last saw you on a wall of ice at the edge of the world asking questions that made men uncomfortable. Tyrion, Jon said, and the name warmed something in him he had not expected to have warmth left for. Your jokes were better then. I had better company, Tyrion said lightly, and then looked about the hall with a face that did not care whether anyone saw it looking. You've made haste. And work. Daenerys cut across him. I am here to claim my father's seat. I am here to begin the work of taking back what was stolen and mending what was broken when madness was mistaken for kingship. You wear my title on your tongue, half of it at least. You call yourself of Dragonstone. I call myself the steward of it, Jon said. He gestured to the painted table. This room had been empty of intention. The island had been left to a garrison of men so tired of being forgotten that they'd forgotten themselves. He met her eye. I needed the mountain beneath it. The dragonglass, Tyrion said, nimble as ever. I had a feeling. There's an old folder full of old pages in some dull man's hand somewhere about those caves that learned to drink fire. I'm sure. You found it in your dreams. Jon looked up at the carved ribs of the hall and thought how close to frankness he could afford to wander. I had useful visions, he said, and let the shape of the truth be its own defense. Show me, Daenerys said. She did not look tired, but there was a quality in her stillness like a hawk at rest, even when not in the air, thinking in terms of wind and prey. He led them down, through the passage where salt had written its thin geometry on stone, and into the mouth of the first cave where light goes in and then returns unwillingly. He took a torch himself for once. Sansa came, silent, with two men behind her who had the look of having slept badly most of their lives. Melisandre had appeared from somewhere as if conjured by echo. Ghost padded along and lowered his head at the threshold, nostrils working at the old breath of earth. They came to the seam where the black glass lies in its ancient grin. Men had worked here for weeks, and already the place had the honest disorder of labor. Stacks of shards sorted by size and stubbornness, lengths of leather cut for hafting, bits of flake underfoot that made a glitter in the torchlight like a cunning night sky. Tormund stood with a hammer in hand and his tongue between his teeth as if delicacy were a game he meant, by will alone, to win at. He bore the hammer like an insult he intended to repay with gentleness. When he saw them, he squinted at Daenerys's hair and looked back to Jon. So, he said cheerfully, you've brought us a bonfire in a braid. Daenerys regarded him with the impassivity of a woman who has learned to translate many dialects of insolence and grant pardons in 3. You are free folk, she said. He raised his hammer as if in toast. We were when we came in. I expect to be when we go out. She is a queen, Melisandre said, almost conversational, and the way she said it carried the fatigue of a priest who has been explaining symbols to people who want miracles more than meanings. Daenerys's gaze shifted to Melisandre and held there. Between these two women the air seemed to make a new silence, as if it were a third person waiting to see which would speak last. You dressed the dead man, she said. Melisandre's mouth quirked. Not in mockery, not in smile. I held the basin and prayed as if it were a knife, she said. We are all servants of something we are ashamed to smell upon our robes afterwards. Daenerys's eyes moved, the smallest degree, back to Jon. Men say you rose, she said. Men say many things. I have learned which to bend my ear to and which to let go past. Let's say you died, and let's say you live. What do you want of me? Jon set the torch into an iron ring on the wall. He set his hand to the seam of glass and felt the cold of it go into his palm with that particular directness men sometimes envy in stone. Fire, he said, and not for thrones. For night. I want your dragons' shadows over the wall when the dead come walking. I want your ships to bear men with black knives north. I want your name to be spoken with gratitude by children who have yet to be born because they were permitted to be born. I want you to stand with me when the wind goes white and we do what our fathers and their fathers failed to write down because winter ate the ink. The spearman, Grey Worm, the name came back to Jon then from rumor and story, stood very still and looked from Jon to his queen and back. If there was ever a man who had learned to hear orders as poetry, it was in that posture. Bend the knee, Daenerys said, and did not say it with cruelty. The world runs on oaths. It runs poorly. It runs. Bend the knee and be the prince of this, and I will be the queen of all, and we will face your night together. Sansa's breath made the smallest sound behind Jon, a catching of thought. Tyrion leaned his shoulder against rock that had learned stubbornness over ages and did not so much as twitch. Melisandre watched the torch as if in its flickering she could see a treatise on the nature of questions. Jon did not step back and did not step forward. "I do not deny your blood," he said. "I do not deny your claim. I deny the urgency of any of that. The dead do not care what we agreed to in rooms. I will not bend the knee in a cave while a storm eats at the cliff and call it wisdom. I will bend it if bending it serves the living. If we live long enough for kneeling to matter to children more than the memory of frost in the lungs, I will kneel or I will not, and that will be a day fit for ceremony. Today I offer you a seat at a table that has not yet disappointed me, and I offer you a war that will disappoint us both if we fight it separately." Tyrion exhaled, a thin, appreciative breath. He looked at his queen and tipped his head in that sideways way he had of making a suggestion seem like a man adjusting his hat. "Your Grace, the last time I stood on this island, I watched a man with a crown measure himself against a table. He made a surveyor's mark of it, very clean. He died believing that if you push pieces this way or that on wood for long enough, you can push men the same way on grass. Jon is offering no such comfort. He's offering knives. Dragons do not answer to men's tables," Grey Worm said, calm as mathematics. "They answer to the breaker of chains." Daenerys's gaze softened only in that it moved from iron to water. Same element, different phase. "And what do you answer to?" she asked Jon. "Dead children," he said. The cave accepted the words and hid them in its belly. Dead brothers, dead sisters, the memory of breath when it fogs in the air in that particular way that says a thing colder than winter is walking under a sky you thought knew your name. "I answer to a promise made in a language no court speaks." She moved then, taking 3 steps that brought her into the reach of the torchlight so that the gold hidden under her hair showed itself. Close, her face was not perfect. It was better than perfect. It had done the work of decision and was honest about the cost. "Very well," she said. "Show me your knives. Call me Daenerys when we are underground and men with ears are only stone. Call me your Grace when we are in halls where the faith counts syllables and stalks grammar as if it were game. Call me ally if that is the truest word you can force out of yourself." He found that he could smile at that very slightly and not be dishonest. "Ally," he said. They stood there a while longer, and she watched the men shape glass, and Jon watched her watch. There is a conversation that happens between 2 people who have both held the attention of crowds and found it insufficient. She asked sensible questions about quarrying and haste. She put her hand on a long, lean shard and turned it this way and that, gauging balance, as if she had handled blades all her life. She sent Grey Worm away with Tormund with a gesture to learn what he could. They went like 2 different kinds of history given legs. Tyrion alone did not look at the work. He looked at Jon instead as if what he found there was a book he had once read and misplaced and now was looking to see whether this was the same edition. "Do you believe it?" he asked when the others had drifted a little away, his voice pitched low. "The walking, the winter with teeth. I have bled on it," Jon said, and the words were simple and uninterested in persuasion. "And died on it," Tyrion added. He turned his head, studied the seam of black that ran like a smile through the stone. "I met your father once," he said, and that was kindness, that he called Ned Stark Jon's father. He had the trick of silence that makes other men hear themselves. He'd like this cave. It speaks in a plain hand. Jon thought of the painted woods in Winterfell's Godswood and how each trunk wrote its own slow letter in the composition of the rings. "He'd like you more than you think," he said, and saw Tyrion's eyes flicker with an old hurt and a small, familiar gratitude. When they came up out of the caves, the storm had spent itself into a sulk. The sky was the color of iron gone dull. The island's vents let out their faint sulphurous breath and tried discreetly to be part of weather. They went to the hall. Stewards moved in that deft humming dance that turns chaos into meat and bread. Sansa had taken off her cloak. Without it she looked more stark than she had in the doorway. the lines of her face writing the kind of poem no bard has the nerve to recite, one about endurance and domestic victories. She and Daenerys looked at one another with the frankness of two women who have made a study of men's stories and declined to be bested by them. "You are his sister," Daenerys said. "I am Sansa," Sansa said. She did not add of anything. "And you are the woman my aunt sold me songs about when I was a child." Daenerys's mouth softened. "Truly now, I would have liked to know your aunt." "Lyanna?" Sansa asked, and when Daenerys's eye flicked to Jon, Sansa's did not follow. "She is the aunt in my father's stories who was a sword more than a flower. Our other aunt was a Tully. She taught me how to smile without promising anything. There is a kind of ease that comes, sometimes, when two careful minds find the same constraints satisfy them both." Sansa gestured toward the painted table. "If you are to be here a while, we might as well sit where the wood is honest," she said. "The chairs near the fire lie to your back." So they sat, and bowls were brought and bread, and that wine again that could not help who it was. Tyrion looked at the table as if it were an old lover who had forgiven him once and might not do so twice. Daenerys put her palm where King's Landing lay and then moved it to the reach as if checking a small fever in a child. Jon watched and remembered his dream of a heartbeat under wood and decided he would not test the notion in company. Davos spoke before the matter had a chance to drift into politeness. "Your Grace," he said to Daenerys, turning the two words into a rope he could coil. "When I was younger and more equal to the folly of believing in men with crowns, I served Stannis Baratheon. He was a man with a straight edge, and he pushed that edge through any balance that didn't suit him. He died of certainty and snow. Before he did, he taught me the cost of good intentions misapplied. We need your fire, not your certainty. That's the best truth I can put into the air without dressing it too fine. Missandei." Jon learned her name later, but even before he had the word for her, he had the sense of someone whose mind walked in slippered feet through rooms where men wore boots. Translated Davos's honesty into the cadence of counsel. Daenerys listened without bridling. Grey Worm returned with Tormund and reported in a dozen syllables that the work below had the smell of honest usefulness. For a moment the hall achieved that rare condition. A room where speech carries weight and not vanity. Ghost rose then and went to the outer doors with his fur up along his spine. Not in fear, not in threat, but in the way wolves do when the air brings them news. A moment later the herald posted on the wall above them banged the haft of his spear to the floor twice. Men turned their heads because the sound had in it no alarm and no boredom. It was the sound one makes when a thing expected early has arrived late but with the proper face. The master of ravens came in with two birds perched like absurd earrings on his forearms. He went down on one knee the awkward way a man does when his dignity fights his purpose. "From the north," he said, holding up the sealed cane. "From Bear Island and from White Harbor, and from a place where the seal was broken and resealed by someone too careful to be honest." Daenerys's brows quirked at that last and then settled. Jon broke the wax with that quiet pleasure that comes from a seal parting properly. The Bear Island hand was small and stern and to the point. Lyanna Mormont's voice on the page, not wasting its ink. It told him where she had put the boys and how many axes she could spare and what she thought of men who counted their courage in chairs. He smiled without meaning to, and Sansa, reading over his shoulder the way sisters are permitted, smiled too and then placed a finger on the line about boys and murmured, "This one will be a vexing old woman if she lives so long, and I hope she does." The White Harbor letter smelled faintly and sublimely of lard and onions. Wyman Manderley wrote as if his hand had once been fat and learned now to travel more lightly than the rest of him. He had 3 small ships by the time the ink dried, he said, and would have 8 by the time the messenger reached Dragonstone. And if the Iron Bank asked too much interest, he had a couple of propositions about pies that would interest them instead. He could spare skilled hands and would provide a cook who would not insult men's tongues for the sake of thrift. The 3rd letter was in a narrow, neat bookhand that took pains not to be beautiful and could not help itself.
No signature.
Jon read it twice before he passed it to Sansa and once again before he placed it on the table so that Daenerys could read it if she chose. It said, "The lioness gnaws at her tail." The city smells of wood shavings where carpenters have been making gallows more meticulously than cradles. There is a river of whispers running from the red keep down to the street of sisters and back. And if you splash your hand in it, it writes names on your fingers you cannot wash out. If you hold what you hold, do not let go until the hand that tries to take it is tired. Varys, Tyrion said, looking at the script without surprise. Or a student. He likes to leave letters at altars and in people's shoes. He also likes to write like a woman who does accounts for a respectable whorehouse. He looked up, mouth tilted. Present company accepted. Daenerys lifted the paper and read it as if committing it to a fire, her eyes steady. When she set it down, she laid her palm flat over the north as if to steady the carved wood under it. Very well, she said. We will mine your glass and we will shape it and we will put it on ships, and my dragons will learn the curve of this coast as well as they know the smell of sand. In return, you will call your lords. You will teach them to count with you, not against you. I will not ride to King's Landing tomorrow. I will sit on this island long enough to make my enemies think I have forgotten them. They will not know what it means when they see smoke in the north if we are careful. A rumor went through the room, soft as a draft and warmer. Relief disguised as a plan. Men stood a degree straighter, as if a small shift in the furniture of the world had allowed their spines to remember their purpose. Torches hummed and devoured the slow air. The painted table accepted the weight of hands and the tapping of knuckles and did not complain. When the meeting ended, it did not end all at once. It unthreaded itself into errands. Tyrion went off to argue with a quartermaster about quantities a quartermaster had already decided on. Grey Worm went to have the closest look a disciplined man can have at a spear shape different from those that trained his muscle memory in childhood. Davos went to the kitchen to show a cook how to bully onions to taste more like themselves and not like regret. Melisandre went to the roof to mutter at stars she had known so long their light seemed a personal slight. Jon went out alone into the small courtyard between the outer wall and the room that had once been a treasury and was now a place where boots were mended. Rain clung to everything still. Where it had settled in small hollows in the stone, it made little mirrors that carried dragons in them when the torches wagged. Ghost bounded out of the shadows and pressed his head against Jon's thigh. The wolf's fur drank light. Jon scratched along the ear and Ghost leaned into it and then went off again to walk the perimeter with the concentration of a keeper who has decided that nothing else will do the job properly. He heard the tread behind him, a heartbeat before the voice. When I was younger, Tyrion said, I believed that if you gave a man a clever sentence at the right moment, you saved him the trouble of courage. It turns out courage, like thirst, does not accept substitutes. I don't know if this is courage, Jon said, not turning. What would you call it? Tyrion asked mildly. Stubbornness, Jon said, or fear put to work. Both admirable when honest, Tyrion said. He came to stand beside Jon and looked out at the narrow slice of black water obedient to the island's shape. You should know that she will ask you for the knee again and again after, and then stop asking for it as if she has learned better, and then ask again once more when you are tired or she is frightened. She will hate herself for asking. She will hate you for making her ask. She will also remember that you did not say no, not precisely. She will learn to live with that. I don't mean to be king, Jon said. Fortunately for the realm, Tyrion said reflexively, and then more softly. And also perhaps unfortunately for you, kingdoms, like women and weather, are insulted by indifference. He tilted his head. You are sure of your parentage? As sure as men who saw it die and wrote it down can make a man, Jon said. He did not explain about the ring on the leather ribbon in his pocket. He did not talk about the way the paper had felt under his fingertips like old responsibility. It changes nothing about what I am willing to be. Ah, Tyrion said. A stark answer, and I mean that as a compliment. He folded his hands. If you are who you are, if she is who she is, if they are who they are, this will be complicated. Good. Simple things are only simple because the dull edge of them has been turned toward us. He paused. You and I once stood on a very different wall and spoke of bastards and books. Now here we are with dragons and knives in a cave. There's no moral in that, but there is a kind of pattern I confess I enjoy. "Life gives us tables," Jon said, and Tyrion chuffed. The first dragon came out of the clouds just before dawn. The night had been an exhausted thing, damp and too warm for health. Men slept with one arm flung out as if to deflect dreams. At the first shuddering roar, men came up onto their elbows with a curse or a prayer poised. The sound was not like thunder and not like wind tearing. It had a throat to it. Jon was already on the parapet when the second shape followed the first, diving, rolling, not playing, not showing off, simply in agreement with the sky that it would be used this way. The third stayed higher and made a slow wheel like a tenant inspecting a new landlord's fence from the air. He had thought he was as prepared to see them as any man without experience can be prepared to see something he does not know the measure of. He had been wrong. Dragons are metaphors given body. They make a man's blood remember fire, and they make his mind crave numbers to set bounds for what numbers are not equal to. The smallest, if such a word can be used for a thing that could take a horse between its claws and rise, beat its wings once and flamed in a short, controlled burp at the sea, tasting it. The smell that came up afterward had a thin sweetness to it, like the moment vinegar stops arguing with stewed onions and begins to assist them. Daenerys stood beside him without greeting and did something with her hands that only a mother does with her hands in the instant before children turn an honest accident into a parable. He looked at her face and saw it gone very young and very old at once. "They like it here," she said simply. "The bones of this place speak to them. They may take a fancy to the garrison stables if we do not warn the horses to be interesting," Jon said, and she laughed. A sudden bursting thing quickly reigned. "They will learn the boundaries," she said. "They always do. The trick is to make the boundary a thing they want to protect." "Like men," Jon said, and her mouth canted, conceding. 2 days later, a small iron-borne ship tried to shoot the gap on an outgoing tide, counting on fog and arrogance. Davos saw the turn of its sail with the intimacy of a man who has made that same mistake in youth. He put 2 archers with dragonglass-tipped arrows in the lee of the spit and let them notch their pride. When the Ironborn saw the shape of a dragon ripple overhead as a shadow, they turned as if someone had struck them across the back with a plank. In the hall that evening, a small argument arose, full of humor and less of scorn than one might expect, about whether that counted as Jon's first victory as Prince of Dragonstone. He let them argue. Victories, like stories you tell children, work better when they are believed rather than ordered. Sam's next letter arrived in a bundle of receipts and a note from a master of ships explaining why oars were more honest than sails in certain winds. Sam's hand said, "I have found the records of an older winter, older than the oldest our singers will admit to. There are drawings here that look like beeswax melted wrong that are men. There is a mention of stone men who were not stone but who had learned to move like it. There is a recipe for a glass made of more than sand. The old men do not like me. I care for them. I think the ones who like me are the dangerous ones. Also, I miss you in the idiot way that makes a man write his feeling on paper and then tear it up. I will tear nothing. Forgive me." Jon folded it, unfolded it, put it to his mouth the way a boy puts a cold coin there, tasting for truth. He wrote back, "I am sorry. Then, I am not sorry. Then read. Then live." When the first crate of finished heads, arrows in 3 sizes, spearheads in 2, a cautious handful of longer knife blades that the smiths had allowed themselves as a treat, went aboard the White Harbor sloop bound north, it carried more than tools. A thin seam of hope ran along the nails in the crate's lid. Men touched it when they passed as if to steady themselves. Sansa watched the sloop go with her hands tucked into her sleeves and gave a series of orders that made plain that hope, like flour, ought to be stored properly lest it mold. Daenerys took to walking the narrow beach early and late. She adopted the habit of taking off her sandals and letting the water take her ankles cold, sometimes so cold that the skin went red and then white and then pale again. Jon met her there sometimes by accident and sometimes by not pretending it was anything else. They talked like people who had learned that nations eavesdrop. She told him one night about a house with 3 doors and no roof and how she had stood under no shelter at all and felt something take the last of her childhood from her and set a crown on the woman's head who was left. He told her about the gods' wood at Winterfell and the sound of wind in the leaves of the heart tree like a choir that tolerates you if you attend in silence. "Will you take the stylus to the painted table?" she asked once. "Will you scratch your name where your island is?" "No," he said. "The table belongs to time. I am its borrower." She seemed to like that answer more than she liked some of his better ones. She took to setting her palm in the same place on the wood each time they spoke, as if one can make a ritual out of an honest thought and teach men to respect it. A raven came from Skirling Pass, its feathers rough from weathering, its eyes proud of the crossing they had made. It bore a note tied with 2 colors of thread, the code Jon had asked for when he'd written to Ed the first time. He took it to the roof to read with the sky a witness. Said, "Bolton's gone. Umber's in disorder. Karstark's a coin flipping in the air. Winterfell wants a steward who is not a ghost. Come home." The next line read in a sudden change of hand, and Jon knew without the signature that Ed had handed the quill to some other poor bastard who loved him into honesty. He held the page in both hands and told himself absolutely the truth and nothing else. Home is any place that asks your better work and forgives your poorer. When Ed's second raven arrived 3 days after the first, it was tied with a single color, and the letters had been written darker and with pressure as if the hand that drove the pen had been angrier than ink deserves. It said, "One of your letters took a long way around and landed in a lion's lap. Men are coming with gold on their tongues to invite us to war against the right enemies for the wrong reasons. I said no like a man with more sense than luck. There is a boy at Last Hearth who has learned to put a sword down when he should. There is a girl at Barrowton who knows where to put a knife. I am trying not to hope. I thought I should practice on you before it kills me." Jon took both letters to the painted table and brought Daenerys and Sansa and Tyrion and Davos like a fisherman brings his catch and cannot say whether pride or fear is heavier. "I have to go north," he said. "I have to look men in the eye so that when I ask them to die later they know who it is that eats the meat at their wakes. You just told a queen you would not kneel because there are more urgent things than ceremony," Tyrion said wryly. "Now you ask a queen to let the only man on this island who can talk to northerners in their own suspicion run away to freeze. Your timing continues to be bad in interesting ways. Go," Daenerys said before any more words had time to fashion themselves into objections. She spoke like a woman who has thought too long about choice to dress it up in lace once she's decided. "I am not your jailer and I am not your interruption. Take a ship that can outrun men who confuse bravery with speed. Take a company that can put a knife between ribs politely. Leave me your sister and your wolf and the only honest man whose thumb knows the measure of an onion. Bring back lords who have learned to say yes because you told them no first." Sansa's eyes slid to Daenerys' face and away and back, measuring. "You are very free with my brother," she said coolly, and Daenerys' mouth softened. "I am not free," she said, "but I am not mean." "We'll take the sea spear," Davos said briskly, as if the decision had involved him from the first. "She knows the water between here and White Harbor the way a man knows the steps to his jakes at night. I can put us on the stone at the Wolfswood's edge in weather my mother would have called irresponsible." "Take Grey Worm," Daenerys said, and Grey Worm did not blink. "I want men from the north to see a soldier stand with a man they call stubborn for reasons that do not include awe. I will keep my dragons here because I am not a fool. I will keep my ships here because I am not a child. When you need them, call." They did not leave for 2 days because the sea refused to be persuaded sooner. Jon used the time like a miser. He walked the shore and tried to teach his feet the letters of leaving written in wet sand. He stood with the miners in the cave and watched a boy with soft hands learn not to be ambitious with a flake. He ate a pie Wyman Manderley had sent that tasted indecently of gratitude. He spoke with Sansa in a room where a narrow slit of a window let a rectangle of gray onto the floor like a small rug a poor man would be proud to own. "He looks at you like a man who thinks you might be a new kind of weapon," she said of Tyrion. "I think he looks at everyone that way," Jon said. "He looked at me like a man looking at a coach with 2 horses who pull in opposite directions and wondering whether the road will forgive them both." She twisted the tie of her sleeve with impatient fingers and then made herself stop. "She will like you until the moment she can't afford to. Then she will respect you until the moment she cannot fail to do otherwise. Then she will pity you because she will mistake your stubbornness for loneliness. Do not let any of these become how you think of yourself. And you? He asked. I am your sister, she said simply. I will not make a philosophy of you. I will ask whether you have eaten and whether the man who sows the north field has seed enough for spring. He laughed, and the sound startled him into gentleness. You will hold here, he said. I will be whatever this island needs until it learns its own habits. She went to the window and looked out at a sliver of sea as if it were a lover she was not sure she trusted. Bring them back willing. He left on a morning that had not yet put its face on. The sea spear sat in the uneasy mercy of the tide, her ropes creaking. Davos went aboard like a man stepping into an old argument he meant to win this time by refusing to take the bait. Grey Worm came with 6 men who looked as like him as discipline can make men look like one another without diminishing them into shadows. Tyrion stood on the dock with his hands behind his back like a father pretending to like school. Daenerys stood a little removed. Sansa did not come down. She stood under the arch and did not lift her hand and did not need to. They ran north quick and dirty and free. There were days when the wind put its shoulder against them like a mother with a stubborn child and moved them along in spite of themselves. There were hours when the sea decided that moving in any direction at all was a form of intimacy it was not prepared to engage in. And then Davos would lean his cheek against the rail as if listening for the pulse of a beast and mutter, and a half-hour later something would shift and the sea spear would remember to go on being a ship. White Harbor rose out of gray water like a holding of bread in a lamplight hour. Wyman Manderley's steward met them with a long list of numbers and a shorter list of gossip and managed by tone alone to make clear that in this city, arithmetic was worship and rumor was a form of taxation. They stayed long enough to collect 2 small boats and for sly men whose faces carried the kind of patience only smuggling and marriage teach. Then they went on again along the coast until the water darkened with the sediment of the white knife and the smell of pine began to write itself over salt in the air. They came in under the barest sliver of moon at a little cleft where the shore pretends to be a mistake. Davos put them onto rock so gently that the sea spear seemed not to notice she had ceased to be an animal and become a house again. He went up into trees, and every step into that dark made him younger and older at once. Ghost vanished as if eaten by the woods and immediately became the wood's eyes and teeth on his behalf. Grey Worm moved through a forest like a man walking through an unfamiliar prayer. Polite, attentive, uncomprehending. They made camp small and cold. A boy found them who had been taught by a father who loved him how to make his breath a thing the air would rather not learn. The boy had a tooth missing from a fight he was proud of, and when he stepped into the thin reach of the fire and saw Jon, he stood a little straighter from a cause he likely could not have named. "Lord," he said. "Jon," Jon answered, and the boy nodded once, precise. They came to a clearing where 10 men waited with the posture of men who would have liked to put their backs against something and could not quite. Ed stood among them like a post that had found itself a tree. His mouth made the shape it always made when he saw a thing that made him hopeful against his will. "When I let you be Lord Commander," he said, "I told myself I was done with the habit of saying yes to foolishness. I see now you've raised the stakes on me." His mouth twitched. "Your friends have helmets that fit." "Unsullied," Jon said simply. Ed glanced at Grey Worm and inclined his head with the lazy courtesy of one soldier to another who is bleeding as much as he is. "Your men will learn to keep their toes warm or the toes will go seeking work elsewhere." He scratched the line of his jaw, thoughtful. "They will scare the Karstark horses, which I shall regard as a domestic benefit. We can put them where the Bolton men left us a memory. Word travels in the north through roots as much as through air. By the time they reach the place where the wolfswood thins and makes room for a field that was once loyal to wheat and now had gone grateful to snow, there were 20 men waiting and 2 women, and a boy with a birthmark like a map of the fingers on his cheek. They came to Winterfell as if the trees had decided not to object. The first sight of the walls was a fist to the chest. The place had suffered and healed. You could read the story in the stonework like a palimpsest. Jon put a hand to the nearest block and felt under limewash and whether a warmth that belonged to fires lit in rooms full of tired people. He did not ask for permission to go to the heart tree. The gods would took him in with that blank patience that trees have for men who insist on making their small storms under its larger weathers. He set his palm to the weirwood and felt nothing at first. Then there was the smallest rearrangement of silence, an almost sound, a not wind. He saw his father's face without remembering he wanted to, and then Lyanna's, which he had wanted to remember and had not dared. The mouth in the white wood did what it had always done. Pretended to witness, listened to everything and nothing, and let men make what they could of that. He spoke aloud and did not feel foolish for it. "I am what you made and what you did not intend," he said. "I will try to be decent. Forgive me for loving men who are not family and for loving families I have not met." He laid his head against the bark and let the cold pass into him thoroughly. When he lifted it, he had that peculiar energy that grief sometimes gives, a steadiness with no brightness in it. When he went back to the hall, men were already waiting. It is a law older than any herald's that if a long table is laid in a room with a fire at one end, the wrong men will sit near the fire. Jon stood at the other end and did not bang a knife on anything. He let the room feel its own noise and then made the smallest gesture, and that was enough. "I have a queen on an island who is not a fool," he said, not loudly. "I have a sister who is building a habit of being moderate on my behalf. I have glass that cuts dead men and I have ships that can carry it. I have a wolf larger than your collective disbelief, and I have a memory of the cold that is a better argument than any speech. I have your names, too." He gestured at the room with one open hand. "Karstark, I will not shame you for the old man's choice. I will shame you if you make the same wrong choice twice from fear instead of loyalty. Umber, you have been a weather vane in a place where weather kills. It's time to be a wall. Manderley, send me meat and send me men who've learned to hold a spear point up when they run. Glover, send me a letter with more ink in the yes than in the excuses." He let his mouth ease. "Lyanna Mormont will instruct any of you not sure how to speak briefly." Laughter made a small, cleansing wind under the rafters. It did not last long, and it did not need to. Men stood, one by one or in little groups, and said the things men have said to Starks in rooms like this since the first stones learned to stack. Some gave their weight easily. Some gave it in the cadence of a loan they expected to collect with interest. One man did not stand at all until the last. When he did, he said, "I lost 2 boys to the winter and the third to a Riverlands woman who cooks better than my wife and has the sense to be grateful to the gods when the stew doesn't burn. I don't have men for you. I have a cart." And Jon said, "Bring the cart." When it was done, the air had shifted the way rooms do after vows. He went back south, thinner and heavier both. Winterfell watched him go with the grave indifference that old houses reserve for men who think they can leave them. The sea spear ran high over swells and then down into them like a song sung by a man with a good ear. On the second night, a wind came off the water with teeth in it, and the crew snarled back with the joy of men doing something they will remember sober. Daenerys was on the parapet when he returned, hair unbound and impatient for the first time he had seen it so, and that alone told him how the days had been while he was gone. She did not greet him with words. She looked at him and read the table of his face for numbers, and when she had them, she nodded once, a book closed. "Winterfell?" she asked. "Still itself," he said. "Cleverer than boys' songs about it. More stubborn than old men's warnings. And the men." "Men," he said. "Enough and not enough. As ever, the North believes itself exceptional, which is its only ordinary quality. Gulls made their idiot arguments in the lee. Dragon wings thudded somewhere overhead with that dim thunder like a heartbeat behind a wall." He remembered, suddenly and entire, Lyanna Mormont's postscript. "Tell the Dragon Queen I am not impressed by her titles. Tell her to send me a list of what she can do with her hands." He did not tell Daenerys. He would another day when they both had the humor to enjoy it. The island took them back up as if the days apart had been a breath, and now they were returned to the business of inhaling. The mines went deeper, the benches for shaping elongated like thoughts that have found their proper verb. Grey Worm put his men through drills on a strip of sand where the tide kept resetting the field. The free folk watched and made sour jokes and copied the movements when they thought no one saw. Davos had discovered a woman in the lower village who could make a stew full of cabbage taste like a story told by a man who had once been rich. He paid her like a lord and scolded her like an uncle, and everyone benefited. On a gray morning when the sea could not be bothered to look lively and the dragon's flights were lazy, a small boat came skirting in with a sail that had been mended with many different colors of thread. The man who stepped out of it moved in the way a man moves who would like to apologize to his own bones for persisting in their use. He had a face like the coast, long, scarred by weather, beautiful only to those who love it. He found Jon without being told where to look, and when he saw him he did a thing Jon would have thought the man incapable of. He hesitated. "Brother," Theon said. Jon did not move. There are men one forgives like a ceremony and men one forgives like breathing without thinking. Theon had always been neither and both. They stood there and held between them every winter lie and every summer kindness they had done each other. In the end Jon put his hand out and Theon took it and made a noise in the back of his throat like a man who had been waiting to drown and found instead that he had insultingly been turned again to shore by a gentle tide. "You look like a man who has decided which pieces of himself he can live without," Jon said, not unkindly. Theon's mouth did a quick, tortured thing that wanted to be a smile and knew better. "I have come because my sister sits in a prison of wood that sways and smells of pitch," he said. "I have come because a man with a crown of nails on his tongue is setting the sea on fire and telling himself a story about destiny. I have come because I could not think of anyone else who would hear me and not throw me back to the sharks for flavoring." His eyes flicked up to where a long shadow passed between light and stone. "You've taken up with dragons. I always thought I'd be the one to do that." Daenerys heard the Ironborn story with the flat face of a woman extending both mercy and self-interest and careful to keep both exactly measured so as not to tempt either into thinking it had primacy. "Your sister," she said, and Theon looked at the ground where her voice landed and nodded once. "She had the good grace not to say what need would drive men to run after Yara on a day when the North gathered knives. Euron Greyjoy is a man who believes he is a miracle and has only his mouth to support the theory." "He is a wind," Theon said, "dirty and without direction." "Winds can be persuaded," Tyrion said dryly, "or trapped." Daenerys looked at Jon. "If we weaken Greyjoy at sea, we make Cersei smaller," she said. "If we make Cersei smaller, we lengthen the time before she becomes desperate. Desperate queens are poor neighbors. Do you have it to spare, men?" Jon asked. "No," he looked at her, and something like a smile threatened them both and did not fully arrive. "Permission? Yes. Use ships that won't be missed here. Do it without noise and do it quickly. If you need a name to blame when the wrong people suffer, blame mine." "You are becoming very good at rule," Tyrion murmured to him later on the parapet. "It must feel like eating rocks sometimes." "It feels like not eating at all other times," Jon said. "It feels like saying no to things men have named yes for years and calling that leadership." "Also rule," Tyrion said comfortably. "Have a care, Jon of many parents. You may find you are better at this than you fear." They sent 2 ships out, sleek and mean, with no banners and a hold full of men who had learned to make themselves lighter than their boots. The night swallowed them. The sea made them into a rumor on purpose. 3 days later, a raven limped in with a message tied to its poor, offended leg that said simply, "Both hands on the throat." That afternoon the wind shifted, and 2 days later the dragons went up and came back with salt on their bellies and satisfaction in their slow, heavy wing beats. Theon stood on the shore and looked at the horizon as if it had admitted defeat and could be trusted for a week. News from the south began to collect against Dragonstone's stones the way foam collects against rock. It was all bad in a way that meant no immediate, specific disaster and 1,000 small ones. The Queen in King's Landing had ordered 3 men hanged who had carried bread to a woman in the wrong dress. A sept had burned not from malice but from too many poor prayers in too small a room. A baker had beaten a gold cloak in a fair fight. Jon listened and learned again the lesson every northern boy learns late and to his dismay, that the south is a complicated beast, and that what eats it is always itself. The north answered him in a slower tongue. The Mormonts sent 10 boys who were shorter than their spears and who held those spears like pride. Glover sent, after a letter of apology that would have been more graceful had it been less precise. 20 men with scars that had learned how to knit and eyes that had learned to stay open under snow. The Karstark boy, Alice's cousin once removed, if the count was done generously, sent nothing but a piece of cloth with an open hand cut into it, a peasant's sign that means I offer and I ask nothing, which in the north is sometimes as good as a host of men. The Umbers sent meat, a lot of it, and said nothing, which in the north is sometimes better. One evening as the sun fought to die pretty and failed, Sansa came up to the roof with a cloak she did not need. She set it around Jon's shoulders without a word and then leaned on the battlement beside him. The sea had accepted the last light and was now a patient animal waiting for night's hand to scratch it the way it liked. I have written to the Vale, she said, as if telling him what she had eaten for breakfast. I have written without asking your leave because I did not want to persuade you and I did not want you to persuade me. I have written to men who remember me as a child and who will find that my hand has improved since. I have written to someone I do not name even to myself. You are allowed, Jon said. I am not a king. No, she said. You are worse. You are decent. She turned her head. We will need that here. The island likes you and it likes her, and it will like you both together or it will ask you both to leave. Old places are cruel like that. He wanted, in that moment, to say a thing less plain than he had grown used to saying. Instead he said, I will try not to make this into a choice between you, and she made a dismissive sound and smiled. Make it a choice between the dead and the dinner, she said. Men can understand that. At last Sam came in person. He arrived not by ship but by accident, having attached himself to a convoy of barrels that fancied themselves destined for respectable sellers and found instead that they had been invited to a war. He toppled into the hall in the middle of a mild argument about whether the sea grapes at Claw Isle were edible or a trick, and he stood blinking as if the light had different ideas about where to land than lights in Old Town have. Jon crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped him, and Sam made a noise like a kettle whose lid has been lifted in time. I brought books, he said joyfully, because there are men for whom that is a declaration of love and victory all at once. Also a baby and a woman and a plan for getting yelled at less. He looked around, and when he saw Daenerys, he closed his mouth and opened it and closed it again and then managed, Your Grace, in a tone of real reverence that was not for her titles at all but for the sight of dragons from below and poets from above. Gilly put the child in Sansa's arms like a gift she was certain would be appreciated, and Sansa did not disappoint her. The child had that helpless weight that makes even watchful women smile simply because a thing so new has chosen to be heavy. Sam began to talk in a stream that taxed even Tyrion's attention and then, with a heroic act of will, cut across his own speech to say the useful things first. There were caches older than any man living could be rewarded for discovering. There were recipes for fire that would frighten wiser men than himself. There were mentions in dull lists of in-kind tithes of men who had chipped at hillocks of glass until their fingers bled and then thanked the gods for the privilege of scarring. You will need a store in the north, Sam said. You cannot ship all the thing up and down in weather that calls ships its toys. Find a hill that will let you love it. Dig into it until the earth tolerates you and then stop before it hates you. Set men there who know how to be bored at the right time. Send a boy who likes lists. He will save more lives than a hero will. Jon looked at Davos, whose face had already begun to arrange itself into the shapes that come with doing a thing thoroughly. Barrowton, Davos said, like a man who names the woman he should have married the first time he married and is punished now by his own correctness. Dry ground with a hill that loves stories. Roads that want to go somewhere useful. A woman there who knows the cost of having a knife and the cost of not having one. He looked at Jon. We'll send a party inland before the snows make jokes of us. Good, Daenerys said, and the word had no flavor of rule, only of alignment. And I will need to know exactly how much fire we dare to put into the air without teaching the wrong men to take shelter in the right places. What else, Samwell Tarly? Sam, who had used up his immediate bravery at the door, took another swallow of breath and found more. Forgive me, he said. There is a mention in tea. He oldest lists of a forge of ice. The room hushed, Men do not like to be told that the inventions of their enemies smell of cleverness. Not ice that melts, Sam added quickly. Something that calls itself ice and is not. Something that remembers winter as a form of law. If they have it, they can unmake what we make when the glass enters the body. Not often, not sure, but once is despair. He looked acutely at Jon, as if pleading with him to forgive him his scholarship. Which is to say, bring fire, bring queens. There are problems you do not argue with. You marry them when they will have you. Daenerys nodded slowly, as if a scholar and not a soldier had finally handed her the name of a thing she had always known by smell. Then we must learn in what order to frighten them, she said, which is an old lesson, but one people grow shy of when they start believing their own songs. They went down again to the caves that night, all of them. Jon and Daenerys and Sansa and Tyrion and Davos and Sam and Melisandre and Grey Worm and Tormund, because Tormund refused to be left out of any story that might feature gods in rock. Ghost came and sat at the mouth like a question. Sam had brought a vial of something that looked like the tears of a god who had eaten ink. He poured a line of it along a ridge of glass, and they stood watching as the line crawled and then stopped and then crawled again, finding the fault, reading stone. Here, Sam said, and here. If you strike so, you can make more with less waste. You will save a man's day. You will save 2 men's fingers. That's a priesthood I can believe in, Davos murmured. He took the tool and tried the strike and made a sound of pleasure a carpenter makes more often than a lord. Daenerys ran her hand along the wall until she came to a place where some old seep had left a chalky residue the color of bone. She leaned in. There are marks here, she said. Not language. Not art. Something that had the idea of both and left a warning or a lullaby. She looked over her shoulder at Melisandre. What do your fires say about words left in stone by hands that were not men's? Melisandre did not pretend to an answer. They say, remember that there are letters you cannot read, she said simply, and that not all of them are written to you. They came up at last when the torches had shortened themselves to small, stubborn lives. On the roof, the night had come together like a cloak. The dragons were gone somewhere farther along the coast, their absence a presence of its own. One's ear listened for them and endued the sky with meaning that might have been only wind. The sea had taken to speaking in a little slap and hush against the stones below, a gentle quarrel with no intention behind it. Daenerys leaned on the battlement and looked north, though there was nothing there anyone could act on yet, only weather and the promise of more. When this is done, she said without looking at him. What will you be? Alive, Jon said. And then? She asked and turned her head. He thought of Winterfell and of the island and of the painted table, and how his hand had learned each curve of the wood and no longer needed to look to know where the reach lay and where Dorne pretended to lie. He thought of a long room under a mountain and how plates and cups sound in that next moment after men decide to laugh and to live another day. He thought of a crown he could wear only if he bent his neck the wrong way to carry it. He thought of a ring on a ribbon in his pocket. Useful, he said at last. She smiled, not surprised, not displeased. That will do, she said. In the morning, a single rider came up the smuggler's steps with a piece of white cloth tied to the haft of his short spear and a face that had learned how not to carry fear in public. He was all leather and knots and a stubbornness that wrote itself in the hips more than the jaw. A Dothrakian land he did not love and would die in if she asked. He bowed and gave them a name Jon forgot at once and gave Daenerys 3 quick sentences in his own tongue before Missandei made them polite in the common. A riderless horse had returned to camp north of the Trident with its saddle frozen from the sweat that had turned to ice on the way back. A man there had seen blue eyes in a wood not yet ready to host such eyes. The villages in a certain bend of the river had begun to keep their doors barred in daylight. Farther south, Jon said quietly than he'd wanted to allow, than I had hoped for the first tales. Sooner, Daenerys said, equally quiet. Then we will stop telling stories and we will start making the one they deserve. She gave orders as if she were a smith with bellows in one hand and a hammer in the other. Tyrion caught them as they came off her mouth and made them into errands for men. Grey Worm unrolled maps he had been ashamed to draw in foreign ink and made them noble by usefulness. Davos went to count ropes. Sansa wrote letters that made men forgive her the unforgivable, that she had grown capable. Sam argued with a steward who worshipped the wrong column and won with a formula. Jon went to the rookery and chose the birds by touch, the way a blind man chooses fruit. To Winterfell he sent, "Call them in, even the ones who make you say ugly things before they say yes." To White Harbor, "Keep your ships tucked like spoons." To Bear Island, "Send me what you have. I will send you back stories worth repeating to girls by fire." To the Vale, "I see you." That one he wrote with a hand that stayed careful even as his heart yearned to hurry. In the night he dreamed a dream not of caves but of a long plain of snow under a fat moon. He stood there with no sound except his breath and the whisper the night makes when it is deciding whether to kill a man or let him make his decision first. In the distance figures moved with no weight to them at all, and in their wake the snow did not look like snow but like something that had been taught to apply white evenly. He put out his hand and felt nothing because the dream did not intend him comfort. When he woke, Ghost was already up, his head cocked, listening. He got to his feet and went to the roof without a cloak. The air slapped him. He took the insult and let it become permission. There on the edge of the world, the sea made a noise like sleep. He thought of men he loved and men he respected and men he would have liked to have met and did not. He thought of Daenerys as a woman in a cave and as a girl by the sea and as a queen with a voice that understood the edges of things. He thought of a table with the world on it and of a knife made of glass that knew more about honesty than any sword. Below him the island rearranged its breath, and somewhere to the east a dragon answered something only dragons hear. Somewhere to the north a riderless horse stood with its black breath going out of it and up into the night, and beside it a man counted his courage against the weight of his fear and decided to send a bird rather than a boast. The world was large and illegible and written down in stubborn inks, and yet for the first time since Knives and Darkness, Jon felt, without speech, that his hand sat rightly upon the day. The sea, that patient animal, lay its head against the black rocks and slept, listening to the small conspiracies of men above. Morning put its pale hand over the sea and found it cooler than a man would expect after so much weather. The island accepted the light with the caution of a creature that has known both kindness and blows. Men came out from under roofs with the faces of men who had slept just enough to know they needed more. They blew on their hands and went for hammers and ropes and ledgerboards and maps, the tools of a war that wanted to be made of patience before it was allowed to be made of iron. The first task was a line of beacons along the spine of the island where the wind ran in a narrow lane like a hound trained too well. Tormund took this work as if beacons were a joke the world had been making for years that he had just now discovered and delighted in. He ran the ridge laughing like a man who knows he will be out of breath in 5 minutes and intends to spend that breath extravagantly. Free folk lads followed him with arms full of brush bundled with sea twine, and unsullied mounted stripped pikes into the rock as poles with a precision that leavened Tormund's noise into function. From below, the line of baskets looked like a necklace an old god had thrown and forgotten. Sansa ordered the island in the quiet way that makes a loud man feel as if he has had the idea first. She arranged the shore fishers and the cliff fishers and the netters who liked their hands better than their eyes. She sent boys with string to count the depth of the rainwater in the cisterns and taught them, with no ceremony, how to remember yesterday's number so that today's would tell a story. She took stock of lard and lamp oil and flax. She found in the quarters below the kitchens 3 women who had allowed themselves to become invisible in the way competent women do when men with titles move through rooms. One had once run a wayhouse on the King's Road and could read the appetite of 30 men at a glance, and Sansa set her over the stews with authority and thanks. One had a shoulder that no longer forgave heavy work but a mind that loved lists, and Sansa put ink back in her hand. One had lost 2 sons to fever and one to the river when he was disobedient and had learned from that grief how to weigh children against tasks. Sansa set her to watch the younger workers who came in from the village to carry and fetch and learned from her where the boys would hide the stolen sausages so they could be warned rather than punished. Men who had never seen a dragon became men for whom dragons were a part of weather. On good days they were wind with muscle. On bad days they were thunder that could choose what to strike. On most days they were simply there. Shadows that dragged slowly across walls, a sound that made a heartbeat deeper in the chest, a smell of scorched salt that clung to the parapet stones. The dragons learned the cliffs. They learned the way the air rose at the island's corners and lay flat over the sea like a table. Drogon took to circling high and then dropping like a hammer for the pleasure of feeling the island stand up to him. Regal liked to slide his belly along the upper gusts as though the sky were a new skin he was making intimate. Viserion developed a habit of hovering over the well court with his long neck crooked like a question, as if he expected water to be a kind of friend and was always disappointed when it stayed itself. Missandei took the measure of the locals with that fine tact which begins with respect and ends with knowledge. She learned half a dozen words of the crab-picker's dialect in a day and a half. She spoke to a boy down by the kelp racks who had taught himself to count by pebbles and could give a precise answer in pebbles faster than men could make the sum in their heads. She spoke to him twice, and the next morning he was standing at Davos's elbow with a bit of chalk, making little fences of numbers around the day's needs with satisfaction. She sat with a woman on a stool outside a door that had no business existing in a corridor that led nowhere and learned from her the names men had given the rooms of the stone drum that had never been written down. She preserved this in a little book and did not call it a book. It lived in her hand like a secret weapon. Tyrion took the quartermaster's accounts apart and then put them together in ways that made the quartermaster suspect he was being robbed until he discovered he had more of what he wanted and less of what he hated. He persuaded a man who had never thought of himself as a leader to become one by the simple means of treating him as if he already were. He found a rope walk in the village that had been left to rot after the last decent master died, and within a week of his first visit men were bringing lengths of new rope up the path, and a woman at the door had begun to charge them extra if they looked rich and less if they looked honest. He told jokes only when there were 3 people in the room, never when there were 20. Men learned from this that his jokes were expensive and began listening to him even when he had none. Melisandre put her hands in water and was surprised each time by its cold. She had fallen out of love with certainty and now courted patience as if it were a shy spirit. On the roof at night she watched the dragon's bright exhalations far off along the coast when Daenerys took them to hunt fish, and she tried, with humility she would once have despised, to learn from the way their fire altered the air and then gave it back. Jon divided his hours as a man divides bread in a room full of children, without satisfying anyone and with as much fairness as he could bear. He spent the dawns at the caves, watching the careful disassembly of rock that would have preferred to remain unbroken, learning to see the fault in a seam with his eyes instead of with his hope. He spent the noon with the scribes, dictating letters whose tone would need to be exactly right to make men who were already giving suspect that they were receiving. He spent the afternoons at the drill ground that Grey Sand had obeyed since some older garrison first marked it out, watching Grey Worm exercise men who had never in their lives moved like this until their muscles thought the new grammar was their own. He spent the evenings at the painted table and found that when his hand fell on certain parts of the carved world his heart moved differently, as if there were a vein of recognition in the wood. And every day 3 times he went to the parapet where the line of the sea met the line of the sky and he looked north. There was nothing to see. That was why he looked. He was teaching himself not to trust the eye. He was teaching himself to honor the nervousness that made men foolish by making it wise. A raven from the Vale came in a little embarrassed, as if it had touched down in the wrong court and was hoping no one would notice. The seal was a mountain and a falcon, old and proud and wrapped around a letter whose hand was not the one Sansa would have preferred. She broke it with a care that made Jon realize how patient she had become with her own disappointment. Lord Yohn Royce wrote as if he were building a drywall, stone on stone, direct, weight-bearing, and not interested in ornament. He said he had the agreement of enough knights to matter. He said there were others who would agree if a certain man would stop putting himself in rooms where people made decisions. He said there was a boy lord with a weak chest and strong vanity and a woman in his ear who spoke 2 languages, one of which was hunger and the other winter. "Peter," Sansa said, not bothering with courtesy titles as if they might conjure the man. She put the letter down and then put her hand flat on it, the way one covers a small animal that one is not yet ready to let go. "He will not come here unless invited. He will write a letter that compliments my handwriting and does not answer my question. He will set a snare for Jon Arryn's ghost and then pretend to be surprised when the ghost is caught. We will not need to suffer it if Lord Euron is as stubborn as I remember." Tyrion, leaning on the buttress with wine he was not drinking, said, "Lord Euron is stubborn enough to make a saint impatient. It's the patience I'm more concerned about. Men like Royce will break bread with a snake if the bread is fresh enough and the knife is clean. Send him another letter, Sansa. Mention nothing of bread. Mention knives." She did. She wrote with a hand that made a case by being calm. She reminded Royce that the Vale had a tradition of not dying for other men's songs. She reminded him that sometimes the only way to honor a tradition is to offend it, and that there are better things than dying for a song, among them living for a story that men will repeat to their wives and make their wives roll their eyes, which is the mark of a story that has the good fortune to be true. She asked for men and grain and the courtesy of truth. She sealed it with the hybrid wolf and dragon that had become the island's badge and sent it off in the beak of a bird who seemed pleased to have a purpose. On the third day after that letter left, a boy came in from the lower village with a cut over one eye that insisted on bleeding every time he forgot about it. He said he had seen a boat at night with no light and men in it with the idea of swords. He had gone for a piss and stepped on a fish spine that sent a line of pain up his leg that he followed like a trail. He had looked back over his shoulder at the sound of oars set in felt and seen the ship's wake writing the wrong letters for a friendly word. Davos went down with 8 men and came back with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a bloody knuckle and a pair of eyes that had been reminded of their trade. "Iron-born," he said, curious rather than devout. They were smelling the edges to see if the island would speak. "I convinced them that there are places where curiosity is the vice that gets a man baptized. They'll tell stories about a white beast on a wall that did not blink. I let Ghost make the argument. It was persuasive. The day after that, Theon came up the steps with 1 man at his back who moved like a gull and 3 who moved like men who would have been gulls if they had been born with wings. Theon had put a little meat on since the first day, or perhaps it was only that his face had found its intended shape again after years of being forced to wear fear. He had a way now of holding his mouth that made him look as if he were keeping a promise to himself, one he had not wanted to make and would not allow himself to break. "They took her east," he said without preface, meeting Daenerys under the arch because he had learned that doors are places where one should not waste time. He does not trust the coast. He says gods gather along coasts, like gulls. He does not want to be where gods eat. "Euron Greyjoy has the one virtue a pirate can claim with any confidence," Tyrion said. "He hates the gods. Would that he hated himself half as much." Theon's eye flickered. "He hates boredom," he said. "Which is worse?" Davos unfolded a chalk chart on a bit of sailcloth that made the hall smell immediately of pitch and old salt. "There's a string of coves under limestone cliffs on the far side of the Fever River's mouth," he said, tapping gently. "If I were a child afraid of being found by my father because I had stolen his favorite knife, I'd hide there and pretend I meant it to be a game." He glanced up at Theon to apologize without wasting syllables. "We can get a small boat in close by night. If there's a ship there, we'll know by the way the tide resents it. If there isn't, we'll know by the way the tide refuses to be impressed. I can take you to the place where he likes to sleep," Theon said. "He has the taste in sleep of a butcher. He wants to wake where he can put his hand into blood without moving his feet." Jon did not love the thought of men leaving the island when news had begun to creep south like frost fingering under a door, but he understood that wars make their own demands. "Go," he said. "Take the boat Davos loves and the rope he trusts. If you bring her back, I will lay a table for Ironborn on this island and we will teach them how to sit without gripping the edge. If you don't bring her back, bring her story." They left at dusk with the tide shouldering them like a friend. The night set a lid on the sea that made sound bigger. Jon did not sleep while they were gone. He walked the roof with Ghost, whose gait at night grew looser, as if his bones were made for darkness. He stopped twice at the painted table and did not put his hand on any place at all, as if to spare the wood the contagion of worry. The second time he found Sansa there with a cloak around her like a hand. They did not speak. They stood listening to the wind behave itself, and after a while Sansa began to count under her breath and then stopped, perhaps ashamed of her arithmetic, Perhaps mindful of the way numbers can make fear seem organized does not make it less. At dawn, a feather of smoke went up from the water just beyond the lee of the eastern spit. Davos had told Jon to expect it if they needed men to be waiting without looking like men waiting. He went down with 6 and found what relief does to the human face. It takes color out of it and then puts it back in again in different places. Theon came up out of the boat with shoulders that had decided to carry themselves again. His hair was wet in the way hair gets when a man has dragged it through sea and sweat and fear, and then taken a breath large enough to begin again. Behind him a woman stood, ropes cut in neat ends hanging from her wrists, blood at her hairline, eyes bright with exhaustion and anger both. And when she saw the dragons circling above in the pale sky, she did not flinch, because she had had enough of being impressed by men's showpieces. "Asha," Theon said with simplicity, and she nodded once as if to introduce herself to a god and be done with it. When she looked at Daenerys, she did not curtsy. She measured. "Greyjoy," Daenerys said. "You've been in smaller prisons." "Not lately," Asha said, and smiled without kindness. "Are those your birds? Do they peck a man if he looks at you wrong?" "They peck a man if he looks at anyone wrong," Daenerys said, and that satisfied Asha more than a greeting would have. They fed her and let her sleep for an hour, and then they asked her questions, not because they could not wait but because she could. She spoke of Euron's new ships as if describing a handsome disease. She spoke of men who have never thought in lines but only in circles, and of how the sea rewards that shape until the day it does not. She gave them nothing they could use this hour against a fleet that had decided to be everywhere and nowhere. She gave them everything they would need later when the sea decided it remembered how to be local again. She sat at the painted table with a bowl of fish stew and gave them the names of ironborn captains who could be persuaded to count. She watched Tyrion's mouth while he worked and liked the way it moved. "I will not bring my men to a rock to be taught manners," she said to Jon when they stood afterward under the arch that looked down at the water. "I will bring them to a rock to be taught to stand in one place and not drown while the sky learns their names. If you can give me that, I'll bring you 3 ships here and 6 there and a nuisance everywhere." "I will give you a place to stand," Jon said, "and a bar to lean your back on that will not give way when a wave tries to make a fool of your weight. The rest is practice." She grinned and clapped his shoulder as if he were a salt brother. "You answer like a man who has learned to listen to rope," she said. "I'll be back with trouble." Sam took apart his books and put them back together until they gave him the answer he thought they had wanted to give him from the beginning. That winter is a thing with history, not merely a mood. That there are tools men can make to be friends to other tools. That there are old angers in the ground that can be asked to favor a man for a day if the right cream of words is poured into the right cracks. He found in a dull miscellany a short list written by a man who hated lists that included a line about horn and ice and ruin. And when he read it aloud, his own voice seemed too loud for the sentence, as if he had knocked a spoon against the rim of a glass in a quiet room. He did not bring the line to Jon until he could frame it with something useful. He came to Jon one evening with ink on his fingers and said, "If they have a thing that breaks what we make, it will be brittle, and it will need to be near what it breaks. This is comfort," Jon said, and smiled in gratitude at a thing too small for gratitude and therefore completely deserving of it. Gendry came to the island in the most natural way possible for a man like him. By mistake, on purpose. Davos had gone to King's Landing, wearing his honest face and a cloak that did not smell of sea for once, to speak to a man who knew the woman who made a certain kind of barrel hoop. He found instead a boy with arms like rope and a squint that always implies a man has had to look for things that other men were given. The boy knew hammers. He knew how to make metal polite to fire. He knew the difference between making a thing useful and making it proud. Davos looked at him and saw a shape that would fit into the day he intended to build. He came up the steps with Davos's hand on his shoulder and a bag over his back with a sound in it that only smiths hear. In the hall, he stood like a man who expects to be asked to go away any minute and does not want to like the room before that happens. Jon showed him the dragonglass benches. Gendry put his hand on the black blades and had the decency to say "ha" in a tone that honored the material. He took up a flake, set it along the edge of a spear shaft, and began to figure out what it wanted to be. In half an hour he had a system. In a day he had improved on it. In 3 days he had shown the leatherworkers how to stitch in a way that saved a finger. In a week he had taught 6 boys in the village to love waste as an enemy more than they loved finishing early. He had the old quality of the best workman. When he was finished he did not show you the thing he had made. He asked you whether it did what you had hoped a thing would do when you began suffering toward it. He did not know who he was, or rather, he did not pretend to know. He knew his father's name the way a man knows the name of a mountain. A truth that has no need to be announced every hour to be present. Tyrion looked at him once and then busied himself with another conversation because he had no desire to be caught on the edge of a certain kind of pity. Daenerys looked at him twice and asked him about forging hooks for a dragon's harness that could be independent of dragon's skin. He grinned at that because he liked the problem. Davos watched him with the particular pride an old man has when he sees a boy he did not raise decide to be decent. The first crate of heads bound for Barrowton left at sundown with a prayer from Sam that sounded more like a set of instructions for keeping the crate dry than like any prayer Jon had heard. Davos had already sent men ahead to make a hole in the hill and teach the hill to welcome them. He had taken with him a letter in Sansa's hand to the lady there, who had been given a reputation by men who were afraid of women who do not faint when bad things happen. The letter did not flatter her. It asked her whether she was still in love with her land. It told her that love can do an ugly kindness when asked properly. He sent another letter to Lady Dustin's castellan with the sort of polite brutality only a smuggler can manage. A list of promises in one column and in the other a list of the names of men who would remember if promises were not kept. Dothraki began to wander the beach as if the edge of the water had become a new step. They learned to cast nets as if the gesture had always been in their wrists. They took to drying fish with the precise boredom of men who have otherwise learned to entertain themselves with speed and found, to their surprise, a contentment in slowness. When a storm came in fast and dirty out of the southeast and made a show of pretending the island was smaller than it was, one of them went up onto the parapet and sang a song that had a gallop in it without horses, a song that made the weather look around and find itself tolerated. Later, when they returned to their camp, they set small fires that used the wind properly, and Missandei took down the words of the song in her small book because you should always write down the names of the songs that persuade whether not to do its worst. Bran's raven came on a noon that had forgotten how to be warm. It landed clumsily, as if the sky had been uncooperative, and when the master of ravens took the tube from its leg, he handled it the way a man handles a letter he suspects is telling him about a child born and a father dead in the same paragraph. The hand on the paper was different from the boyish one Jon remembered. It had become air writing through a boy rather than a boy writing what his hand wished. It said things that were not sentences because sentences are inefficient when you've outgrown sequence. It said, "They are on the ice river." It said, "The one that leads them now has learned the habit of waiting and put it on like a cloak." It said, "The wall holds because it has been told to for a long time and because it believes itself." It said, "If you bring fire you will find something that believes itself also. You will need to make 2 things stop believing at once." There was a line beneath all that made Jon sit, not because it was heavy, but because it was light and would float away if he did not pin it somehow by being present when he read it. It said, "You are where you should be." And then, as if the writer had remembered he was a boy with brothers, it said, "Tell Sansa I remember the dress with the little swans she liked when she was 7. Tell her she can stop disliking it now." Sansa read it and did not smile and did not cry, which is sometimes the bravest thing a face can do. She placed the letter under the small weight that Davos used to keep his receipts from fleeing and stood a while looking north out of a window too small to give a man much hope and too honest to give him a lie. Later, she went down to the village and hired 2 more women who could count. She came back up to the hall and told Gendry that if he made for her a set of 12 small hooks, as if for a lady's hairpin but stronger, she would be grateful and would pay him with something he would later admit was valuable. When he did, she gave the hooks to the cook with instructions to hang boots upside down in the drying room so the leather would not grow salt sores. There is a way of ruling that begins with boots and ends with treaties. It was a day of small rains. The island smelled of stone that has been told a joke. Tyrion set markers on the painted table to show where food would be when it needed to be somewhere else. Daenerys sent 2 riders south to look like messengers who had lost their way and were to be pitted and listened to rather than arrested. Missandei found a way to put words to the thing the Dothraki had been doing with their nets that made the old fisherman nod, as if a foreign child had managed to say their grandmother's name properly. Ghost slept on the step at the mouth of the great hall and refused to admit that he was sleeping. At dusk a sail showed itself under the pale gold and then vanished again like a fish's back. Davos watched it and made a series of calculations that looked a little like prayer. "Honest," he said at last. "Or trying to be." When the ship slipped into the lee, it showed a painted hull that had been mended and mended again and therefore was not proud. The banner that went up was the Grafton Gull with a little salt on it. And men on the parapet looked at one another with the satisfaction islanders have when a city on the mainland remembers that islands exist. Gulltown had sent a captain with hands that told his story better than his mouth. Scars on the fingers that come from hammering nails at odd angles, a broken joint at the base of the thumb that only shipwrights acquire, burn marks on the backs of the knuckles that come from picking up hot tools without the sense to wear gloves. He bowed to Daenerys because one should bow to a woman who can call names to the sky and make those names have bodies. He bowed to Sansa because one should bow to a woman who can make 3 men stop talking by lifting a finger a quarter inch and looking at a ledger. He offered 4 ships to be made into 6 if timber could be had without begging it. He brought news that the Vale was stirring, that Peter Baelish had begun writing letters to himself, which is always an interesting development, that Lord Yohn had called men into a field and told them to say aloud what they meant, and many had done so, and the sound had been more than a rumor. Jon took from him what news can do without injuring itself and gave him back paper that could be shown to a yard foreman with the dignity of an order without the arrogance of a decree. He told him that if the Vale could spare riders who knew the river roads from Coldwater to Heart's Home, the island would repay them in glass and hard bread and the sort of fame men acquire when they behave well without witnesses. The captain liked this because he had grown tired of famous men and their small appetites. He left with his pockets heavier than they had been and his face lighter. When the night settled down to its version of quiet, Daenerys went to the roof with a cloak she forgot she wore. Jon was there because it had become his habit to be. They stood side by side with no formality and listened to the dragons reduce distance. After a time she said, "When I was a child in a house with no roof, Viserys told me that Dragonstone was a promise the world had made to us and had forgotten. He told me we would reclaim it and the promise together, and it would make us into something people could not ignore. He was wrong. It was not a promise. It was a place. Places do not love men. They tolerate them if men are useful. Places sometimes love dogs," Jon said, and Ghost obligingly thumped his tail and produced a huff that had all the dignity a beast can muster when his name has been mentioned without the present of meat. Daenerys's laugh came out of her like a thought she had not meant to share and decided she did not regret. "And dragons," she said, looking up. "Sometimes places love dragons. This one does. It remembers them in its bones." "It remembers other things too," Jon said. "There is an old anger under the glass. Sam can smell it. The rest of us can only feel it. Like a stone in a shoe we think we have thrown away but find again when we put the shoe on next morning." He paused. "Bran writes like weather. He says they are on the ice river. He says the one that leads them now has learned to wait. He says the wall believes itself. The wall has that right," she said thoughtfully. "It was made to believe. The men who built it taught it a prayer and set it to repeating the prayer until the end of days. Men do that with children. Sometimes it works." She leaned on the parapet and let her arms take the pressure. "We will have to be unkind to something that believes itself. We will have to be unkind to many things," he said, and they stood there a while and did not count them. Drill went on, honest and tedious. A group of Stormlander lads learned to hold a line under Grey Worm's eye until they forgot they had been taught and began to believe they had always known how. A girl from the village who had a fierce joy in throwing things found out that if she threw short spears into a set of straw targets for 2 hours each day, her arm grew a new muscle that surprised her when she bathed. Davos built out the little pier on the lee side with his own hands, carefully, as if he were persuading the island rather than taking it. Gendry broke 2 knife blades pushing where patience would have done and looked pleased to be corrected by the lesson. The dragons took to sleeping in a rhythm men could anticipate. The cook discovered that if she boiled kelp with vinegar and honey, the Dothraki would eat it on purpose. which saved meat for men who would not. There came a day when fog took the island under its arm and would not let go. Sound went strange. Men laid hands on stone more often, as if to keep the island. Someone dropped a crate of spearheads, and the noise of it was like hail in an iron forest. Toward mid-morning the fog dissolved in place into a mist, and then the mist decided to become rain, and then the rain had a thought and became snow. It was not a serious snow, not the sort that wishes to teach men humility. It was the sort that floats down to test whether the island is a place where it can make a home later. The first flake that melted on Jon's cheek gave him a feeling so deep in his chest he would never tell it to anyone. He blinked and felt as if he had just swallowed a truth, badly. Out in that weather, nearer the northern horizon than a sensible man can see from Dragonstone, riders moved along the long curve of an old riverbed, and beneath their horses' hooves the ice sang the thin song it sings when it is deciding whether to trust a creature's weight. One of the riders had eyes that had looked from different places in the world and found all of them insufficient to his curiosity. He laid his palm on the horse's neck without looking, the way a man lays his hand on a friend's shoulder when he has just understood a thing and needs someone else to share the news with. He smelled a smell he had smelled before under trees that had never learned names for themselves. He lifted his hand and signaled to the men behind him without posture. There and wait. When he settled back into his saddle, the snow took his shape and held it in the air like a signature. On the island, Ghost lifted his head and made a small sound, nothing more than a note held too long. Jon felt something inside the note and went downstairs without haste but without asking himself why. At the painted table, he found Sam and Sansa leaning over the place where the last river relents. Sam had a bead of ink on his knuckle that had refused to be wiped away and looked, absurdly, like a tiny birthmark. Sansa's hair had come loose on one side and she had not noticed it. They were speaking over numbers not because numbers were right, but because numbers are a language men stop arguing with sooner than they stop arguing with words. Davos came in as if the door had taught him to move like that. "There's a ship," he said, and then he smiled a little at Jon's expression. "No, don't fret. From the Manderleys, the one with the cook who makes a pie like reason. She's bringing a priest and a cask of something the label says is cordial and the smell says is a mistake. The priest turned out to be the sort of man who will set a broken arm properly and say a prayer as if it were a stitch. He wore the 7-pointed star, but he did not wear it as an argument. He came to look at the mines not because he had a sermon to preach against men taking knives from the earth, but because he liked the sound a skilled hand makes on rock. He blessed nothing and reproved no one. He left a handful of good words behind him like nails for a man to find later when a chair needs mending. He was the sort of priest Davos liked because he was useful and the sort Jon liked because he did not sound like he was trying to convince himself. When the cordial was opened and proven to be more patient with the water in it than without, Sansa went to the roof and let the light snow melt on her cheeks. She felt the island sniffing the weather like a dog. She thought of Winterfell with a sudden fierce missing that did not demand to be indulged. She had learned something he had not known she needed to learn. That one can carry a place and not beg it to carry you. She stood a while and then went down and found Missandei and asked her to show her how she kept her hair from suffering in salt air. Missandei laughed and produced a little jar that smelled like a tree that had not yet learned to be lonely. In the night, there was a sound like a great beast turning over in its sleep somewhere farther north. Men do not hear such things with ears. They hear them with the instincts their fathers had and forgot how to name. Jon woke and went to the window because windows help a man pretend he has direction. He looked out into a sky that had made itself into a very careful blank, and then went to the painted table and laid his hand on the curve of land where Eastwatch kept its promise. He felt nothing except wood and his own blood. He stood there with that honest disappointment and then made it into fuel. At dawn he called in the hall for men who were willing to be bored in the right places in the north for a long time. He got more than he had expected and fewer than he had hoped for. He divided them into 10s and put a free folk man over each 10 and a Stormlander over each pair of 10s. And then he put Grey Worm over the Stormlanders because he had learned that the chain must be both strange and familiar to keep men from believing it had been meant to bind them. He gave Sam a list of the men and made the maester write their names into a book with a hand that looked too fine for the task, and then he made the maester write their names again with his other hand, badly, because men who count must learn to count imperfectly in case the world does not give them a fair page to write on. Daenerys did not interrupt him. She listened and added nothing because he had not forgotten anything she meant to remember. Afterward, she took Drogon up into a sky that had deigned to become clear and let the dragon breathe just once over a piece of dead water to see whether fire could be made to lay itself down precisely where a woman wished it. She brought him back sated and not proud, and she went down to the village and stood with the women by the kelp racks and watched them argue amiably about the best way to dry a thing that did not want to be dried. She said nothing. She learned 3 tricks she would later apply to weather and men both. Asha left and came back and left again with a rhythm that made the island begin to set a place for her in its courtesies. She brought in 2 sleek little gull-wing ships built in a cove where her uncle would not think to look, with crews who knew the difference between bravery and shouting. She delivered to Tyrion a man with a book of accounts showing that Lord Grafton had overcharged the Greyjoys for tar by a percentage the book called acceptable and Tyrion called delightful. She delivered to Jon the name of a cove on the north side of the Lonely Light that no Ironborn who had ever lived had used twice because it made them nervous. Jon wrote it down because nervous coves make for good hiding places when the sea is paying attention. When the letter came from Lord Euron agreeing to send men down the east road toward the sea for a handoff with White Harbor's carts, Sansa allowed herself the smallest ceremony she had permitted all winter. She took the first coin of the first purse and pressed it into clay and kept the impression because sometimes a woman is allowed to make a small shrine to competence. The letter also said that a certain man had left the Eyrie on business to the south. It said this with a dryness that let Sansa imagine the pleasure with which it had been written. She folded the page once and then again without creasing it hard enough to make a line, and she put it away. Theon told Jon a story one night that he had never intended to tell anyone. They were standing on the little pier Davos had built in the lee, and the tide had set itself to a particular music of small slaps and a long hiss that made men sentimental if they were inclined and irritated if they were not. Theon said there had been a day, years before, when he had stepped onto a beach thinking himself a prince. He had looked up and seen Winterfell from the road and tasted a thrill that had felt like victory and been something more like childishness. He had told Jon he was a fool then, and he was right, and he had gone on being right for longer than any fair punishment would have required, and now he was tired. He said this without self-hatred and without pride and without asking for absolution, and Jon loved him for precisely that combination. "You will die," Jon said, "not as a curse and not as a blessing, simply as a statement of the condition men are in. So will I. Try not to do it doing a stupid thing you would not be proud to have a child repeat." Theon laughed with his whole face this time, the sound startling him. "I have never been so in love with the idea of boredom," he said. "If you find a way to bottle it, sell me too." Toward the end of that week, the sea gave back a ship it had taken earlier without apology. It was a coaster from the arbor, light in the water, its sail mended with a patch in the shape of a dolphin which was either endearing or arrogant. Its captain told a story about a southern port where men had begun to gather the way quarrels do in a small room, about how the queen's men had grown nervous of spear points and gossip both, about how a whisper had been heard in taverns from the riverlands to the neck, "The North and the dragon are one." The captain told the story with the relish of a man who enjoys being at the mouth of a rumor that has a pleasant taste to it. He sold them wine he pretended was better than it was and left with a letter from Tyrion to a man in Old Town that contained jokes and arithmetic and a single thin threat like a wire. Jon spared a morning for the miners and then another, because time spent with men who chip at what resists them teaches patience better than prayer. He took up the knapper's tool and failed twice at a blade that would have been too proud of itself to survive a week in a sleeve even if it had come off right. The third time he made a cut that allowed the hidden shape to declare itself. He held the thing a moment, pleased in a way he rarely permitted himself, and then handed it to a boy with hands like birds and said, "It's yours." And the boy gave him a look that would be more nourishing than food on some later day. He wrote to Ed with these small victories because men at the wall live on them. He told him the Vale had decided to be reasonable for a month. He told him that the Manderleys had found a way to make onions tell more of the truth. He told him that a boy had made a blade out of glass that had wanted to be a blade even before his hand found it. He ended the letter with a line he had not planned. "I am afraid in a way that feels right." He set the seal and sent it and let that honesty remain true for the day. And then, as days do, this one broke. It broke with a sound in the air like something large exhaling to make room for itself. The dragons had been down the coast, and now they came back very quickly, too quickly to be casual, with their heads up and their wings working not with elegance but with intent. Men on the parapet looked up with the startled joy people feel when familiar miracles take a new line. One of the dragons, Regal, had a patch of whiteness on his left wing where frost had set its teeth and then been made to let go. As he swept over the hall, flakes came off like dandruff of a god. Daenerys was on Drogon's back and not wearing a look any man would want to meet in a dark corridor. She brought him down into the court with a delicacy she would deny knowing she had and slid off with a stiffness that told Jon she had stayed in the air longer than was comfortable for a human spine. "There is a place," she said without greeting, 3 miles north of Sharp Point along the coast. A crack in the cliff where the sea goes in to argue with the dark. The water in there is wrong and cold in a way even the air does not like. Something has touched it that had no business learning to touch anything. Tyrion began to speak and stopped himself because there are sentences that a clever man learns to leave outside. Jon looked at Grey Worm, who had come at a run and did not appear to be breathing hard. "Take 20, he said. "Not men who will be brave because they want to be seen. Men who will be brave because they know how to hide. Take Tormund." He added as an afterthought with grim amusement because Tormund believed hiding was a game small boys preferred to other games. And yet he could do it when he decided to be serious. They went down the steps with the sea running beside them and then left the steps where the rock offered handholds to men who did not demand courtesy. The crack in the cliff was a mouth that did not want to be fed. The water went in and came out with a sulk. Between it and the roof there was a space barely wide enough for a man with his shoulders turned. They moved in a file with the sound of water making the only comments. Lights went ahead in a workman's way close to rock, cautious. After a time the tunnel widened. After another time it widened again. Then it opened like a bell. The cave had not been made by water alone. There were marks, some of the kind Sam had found. Not letters, not pictures, the stammering of a mind that had ideas but not language. There were other marks, newer and worse. Long streaks where frost had taken a bite at stone and left a sign of teeth. On the far side, where the cave narrowed again toward a dark throat, there was a low whiteness that had the shape of foam but was not foam. Tormund went to it and put out a hand, and Grey Worm caught his wrist with a grip that did not allow an argument and shook his head. Tormund made a face that suggested he had been denied a sweet and then stepped back. Jon went forward because sometimes a man must be the one who goes forward when there is a thing that belongs to him. He crouched and put out his hand and held it a hand's breadth away from the whiteness and did not touch. The cold there had a sentience, if cold can be said to be anything but lack. It reached toward his skin as if to read it. He withdrew and stood and felt in his mouth the taste of a winter that had decided to learn a new trick. He looked back at Sam, who had come behind them with a caution that had less to do with fear than with respect. Sam had taken off one glove and was holding up a bit of metal that looked like nothing anyone would bother with and everything men ought to fear. "Ice blackened," Sam said softly, "by fire, then fixed by something colder than that. They played at making themselves tools. They are clumsy, thank the gods. They will become less so. We should burn it," Tormund said, with the simple practicality of men who do not enjoy complications. "We should unteach it," Sam said, surprising them all with the severity in his voice. "Burning will be teaching. Fire will tell it how it must be broken. It will learn. Let the sea do it. It forgets more than fire remembers." Jon nodded because the logic felt like something the island itself offered. "Back," he said. "No more than we need to leave. Nothing that will give a clever thing a map." They withdrew with the discipline Jon respected in Grey Worm and the humor he depended on in Tormund, who muttered all the way out as if he had been denied a story he had expected to enjoy. When they reached open air, the sky felt like a reprieve. Jon looked down at the water shirring along the base of the cliff and imagined winter putting its mouth to the cave's lip like a man to a bowl. He looked up and found Drogon's shadow crossing him and did not duck. Daenerys stood on the edge with one hand on the stone, not for support, but because her hand had wanted to know what the island knew. "The world is learning our names," she said without ornament. "We should teach it how to pronounce them." They set a watch on that crack and on 3 others like it. Not a noisy watch, not a proud one. A watch made of habits and men who can persuade their own minds to become a thin wire and draw taut and hold. They adjusted their drills. They altered the method by which they stored the finished heads so that cold could not enter in any ordinary way. And then they assumed the cold would teach itself an extraordinary way and prepared for that. They sent a thin letter to Old Town asking a question so specific the maesters would have to answer even if they hated answering in principle. Sam bribed a man he used to despise with a story he had not yet written and got a recipe out of it he believed might make leather a little more rude to frost. He tested it on a strip hung where the cave breathed. It did not fail. It did not succeed completely either. He wrote this down, and that humility put weight into the success it had. Jon took a small party north a last time before the sea grew reluctant, unwilling to trust any letter that tried to cross it. He left Sansa a list of things to do that did not need his permission and told her she ought not to ask him what to do anyway, which she accepted with the weary courtesy of a woman who has been running a household since childhood and being thanked for it only when men remember they like hot bread. He left Daenerys a list with nothing on it but the words "do as you think best," which was either laziness or faith in a language she understood because she had been speaking it to herself for years. He left Ghost, and Ghost took up a position by the door where he could judge every man who thought about entering and hesitated long enough to prove he was worth the room he wanted to enter. He went with Davos and Grey Worm and 8 men who could move through trees without teaching the trees their names. They came down the white knife by tricks Davos had kept from his fingers like food for a lean day, and they walked the long miles up into country that still carried the footprint of the last army that had run there and had not set itself right yet. They found Ed in a yard that had once been a sheepfold and was now a place where men learned to give up some of their breath without losing any of their life. They went on with him under a sky that could not make up its mind whether it was clever or merely dull. They found in a shallow ravine a small set of bones that had made a campground of the last leaves. They burned them because it would have been an insult not to. They watched the smoke climb and flatten and continue on. They slept in shifts and woke and moved and stopped and moved again until the body forgot to complain in sentences and expressed itself only in the soft grumbles of a tired animal. On the 5th day they came to Eastwatch. The sea there was a different beast entirely. It did not pretend to like men. It barreled up against the foot of the wall as if it had a personal grievance. The wall itself looked less like a wall here and more like a decision. The men who kept it looked like men who had chosen to be stubborn in a place that had been chosen for them. They smiled for Jon in the particular way men smile who are pleased to see a face they trust and do not wish to waste their satisfaction by making it too large. They gave him stew and bread and a bit of gossip about a man from Hardhome who had come in once with eyes like a fish and then died when he saw a piece of coal and thought it was the sun. Jon went up to the top and stood in a wind that took his breath not because it was cold but because it had something in it that was older than cold. He looked north and saw what he had always seen. White that was both bare and full. He stood there long enough for his mind to decide it had had enough of feeling small and begin to think it had learned something instead. He went down with the simple grace of a man who has played on a great swing and is happy to have his feet back on dirt. They surveyed, they argued, they counted, they made jokes which work best near a great and serious thing. Davos taught a boy to tie a knot that would not betray him and felt as proud as a father can allow himself to feel when the boy got it right. Grey Worm stood and watched men come and go and assessed the invisible lines along which discipline ran in this place. Ed told Jon a story about a squirrel who had learned to steal bread and then taught the other squirrels to steal bread, and that the squirrel had a scar across its nose and a temper. At night in Eastwatch, a man sleeps the way a house sleeps when the wind chooses it and lets it live for a while. Jon woke before dawn and went up again and stood where the wind had a habit of changing directions without apology. He did not expect to see anything. He did not. He went back down with that disappointment turned into a kind of steel. He left a list. He left a crate with 12 spearheads taken from the first crate the island had sent, because sometimes it does men good to have the first of a thing with them. He left a letter for the boy with the knot saying, "If you forget how to make it because your hands are cold, make another knot you can tie with cold hands." He left Ed with an embrace that would have embarrassed them both if the world had been smaller. He went back down the river and out to the sea and let it insult him and carry him both, and he went back to the island that had taken him on for a time as its steward. When he came up the steps, the light was the light of the hour before supper. He heard voices in the hall that did not belong to those who lived there. He stepped under the arch and saw the veil in a cloak and the veil in a jaw and the veil in a habit of standing as if the air were always judging him. Euron Royce had come, steel at his hip, courtesy in his mouth, intention in his eyes. He made the small bow one makes to a man one is prepared to respect. Sansa rose from the painted table with an expression that admitted she had been right and forgave him for taking so long to appear. Daenerys turned and raised her chin and let her silence be the first test. "Lord Royce," Jon said, and Euron smiled with his mouth shut, which is to say like a northerner. "I've brought you men who like to stand in a line and men who like to break a line," he said. "I've brought you a baker who is better at bread than his father says he is, and a blacksmith who likes horses, and a priest who prefers to wash his hands before he blesses anything. I've brought you 3 boys from the Fingers who think they're famous and who will be less so by next week. I've brought you a few ladies who insist on armor being made for them properly and who will not thank you if you comment on it." Sansa smiled properly this time. "We will not comment on it," she said. "We will measure them and give them what they ask for and send them out to do what they came for. Thank you for the men." Royce looked at Daenerys with respectful speculation. "Your Grace," he said, "I was not told I would be instructed to kneel. It has been my experience that kneeling is best kept for gods and trees and wives who have misplaced a ring." Daenerys's mouth quirked. "I do not require it," she said. "I require men who can stand." "Good," Royce said. "Then we will stand." He looked around the hall with seasoned curiosity, the way farmers look at other men's fields. "You have made this place your friend quickly." "We have made it our work," Jon said, "which is the only way to make a place anything but your enemy." That night, with a new voice in the hall and new boots in the passageways and a new smell of leather in the little rooms near the kitchen where armor wards its own sleep, Jon stood under the strip of sky visible from the roof walkway and let the cool air make a case to his skin. He thought of the field at Winterfell and the green beneath snow and the way men stand up one at a time until they are together without any one of them knowing when that happened. He thought of Dragonstone and its bones. He thought of a cave under a cliff where a cold had learned to want and had not yet learned how to get what it wanted. He thought of the table with the world on it and how the world had never once stood up off that table and decided to be a better thing on its own. He went down and slept. In the morning he woke with the feeling a man has when he is called by his name from a distance by a voice he cannot ignore, and he followed that feeling to the painted table. He laid his hand where the north rides into the neck. He took it away. He put it back again. When he looked up, Sansa was there, and Daenerys was there, and Tyrion and Davos and Sam and Missandei and Grey Worm and Tormund. And Euron Royce had come in and stood with that watchful ease men have who are not sure they belong and will make themselves belong by being useful. "We leave in 4 days," Jon said quietly. "Not to fight, not to throw ourselves at something to prove we know how to die. We leave to show men what must be seen and to bring back a truth that does not tire. We leave to put glass in hands and fire on breath and the knowledge of both in heads. There will be many who say we ought to go sooner and many who say we never should. For days will be the right lie between their truths." Daenerys nodded as if she had already had the thought and approved of it coming out of his mouth rather than hers. Sansa set her hand to the face of the table where the river road runs to Barrowton and tapped twice, a small drumbeat that said provisions quietly. Tyrion sighed in the way men sigh when the day's work calls out the door and you discover you were already dressed. Davos grinned a little because ropes like dates have a way of concentrating a man's mind. Sam pulled his bit of ink-stained rag from his sleeve and wiped his fingers as if in hope that the gods would show mercy and make the writing easy. Missandei made a list in her head that she would write down in 6 hands and 4 languages. Grey Worm lifted his chin the half-inch a soldier needs to promise himself a certain number of acceptable deaths. Tormund scratched his beard and said, "Good," in a tone that implied he had been starved of a particular kind of food and saw a table being laid. They moved, then. They moved as the island had been teaching them to move, with a mixture of speed and the courtesy of not bumping into the stone. They moved with the hungry energy of men who have been waiting for a long time and now are permitted to run. They moved without shouting because people who know what they are about do not need to explain it to the air. On the second day of that beginning, a storm came up out of the east with style, with intention, with an artist's confidence and a thug's pleasure. It pounded the sea flat and then threw it up again and then whisked it away as if laughing. It turned the dragons into narrow shapes cut out of the sky and conged the rigging into harp strings that made music men do not like. It found the beacons along the ridge and tried them and found them sturdy enough to be worth its honor. It pulled a tile loose, somewhere, and sent it skittering along a roof and down into a lane, and the lane accepted it like a gift and did not tell anyone about it. Jon stood in the lee and let the rain beat his face and learned again the old lesson. That the world is too large and his plans too fine, that the only way through is to make the fine plans and hold them softly and the large world and love it fiercely. He put his hand to the stone and in that moment the island felt to him like a living thing that had decided to trust him for the space of a breath. He took that breath as if it were rations. When the storm moved on, as all storms must if men are to go on being men, the air behind it had a clarity that made even old objects look new-minted. A boy looked at his own boots and felt fond of them. A woman looked at her own hands and forgave them a small ache. The dragons went up, the miners went down. The scribes scraped their pens over a bit of oiled leather because the paper was damp and would not obey. Sansa kissed the top of the child's head in Gilly's arms without making a ceremony of it. Tyrion found a single good plum left in a basket of poor ones and ate it with the reverence an old sinner sometimes shows a small mercy. For days later, at dawn, the sea was as flat as a thought. The sky had taken off its ornaments and put on its work clothes. Men stood in the court with packs that had been weighed 3 times and cut twice and then weighed again. The white harbor sloop that would carry the first load of glass north with them sat in the lee as eager as a dog. Davos went down to speak to her in the way men do who have known ships as lovers and wives and enemies. Grey Worm stood with his men at a slant that told Jon they were ready to hand him their deaths if he called for them and their lives if he did not. Jon Royce had sent 20 men who could shoot and would not brag about it, and he had sent with them a boy who could keep a fire going in wind without looking smug about it. Tormund had 7 free folk who had decided not to die in their beds, and 2 who would rather have died in their beds and knew better and had come along anyway. Daenerys put her hand on Drogon and then on Rhaegal and then on Viserion and spoke in a low voice in a language that makes names into praise and praise into obedience. Drogon huffed at her and leaned his head a little heavier against her palm as if asking for a last scratch, and she obliged him. She looked at Jon and did not say be careful. She said, be useful, which is a better benediction. He slung the pack that had the weight in it that a man remembers at night. He looked up at the tower's line against a morning that had not yet made up its mind about men. He put his hand to the wolf and dragon seal at his throat and then took his hand away. He looked at Sansa and took from her the rope she had made him carry for no reason at all except that rope is always a good idea. He looked at Sam and smiled at the ink on his knuckle because the world contains small loyalties as well as large ones and men are warmer for having both. He went down the steps with the sea breathing beside him. He went with Davos and Grey Worm and men who had chosen to be bored and die right, and men who had chosen to be excited and live if they could. He went with the weight of an island's bones behind him and the pull of a wall's old promise ahead. He went as a man goes who has decided what his name means and is willing to let the world attempt to talk him out of it. He went because winter had taken up writing letters and had begun to sign them in men's blood, and because he had pens and a table and a better story to tell, and because it is a kind of mercy to tell it in person. The island watched him go with the grave courtesy of places that have learned not to beg. The dragons rose and made the air a moving thing. The beacons stood quiet and will be useful later. The painted table remained where it had been since a certain stubborn king had made it for his hand to move across. and on it were the lightest of marks made by men's palms when they have leaned in to look at what they are capable of and then gone out to try it. The sea took hold of the sloop and moved it away from the rock and toward the line where sky and water make their old, dishonest promise of being the same thing. The day began and continued and asked to be met, and the men in it lifted their feet in answer.